That guru. Let's see. Alright. I'll do mine first as a test run. Let's see. Boy, that thing's not that easy to see, is it? Alright.
I was just happy to find you had I figured you'd have presentation stuff.
Let's see. Here we go. Copy. Now, where do I want to put it? I guess I'll put it on desktop.
Make it easy.
Yeah, and then just say, what do I do here? What's it doing now? Oh, where's desktop?
I think you can just,
Why didn't it just take it?
yeah.
I should have just done it. Let's see if it did. Maybe it did. You see it here?
No.
So just type this. It's on camera. So I just want to.
Oh,
yeah,
we're gonna.
yeah.
Okay.
So let's tidy up the cursor.
Yes, there you go.
Nice screen.
So why isn't that just copying to? You know what I will do instead? Let's see if there's some sort of general thing here. I'll just put it right in the root.
Yeah, it should have just gone right onto the desktop, shouldn't it?
That's what I thought, but I'm really not. Hey, let's just do again, copy.
Will it let you just drag it onto the desktop?
It might, but I'm not good at that. Sometimes I end up, let me just put it right here and then I'll just, oh, wait a minute. Administrative cancel. Gosh. This. There we go, there's one, and I would just open it, and then it'll be down here.
Oh, there you go.
And minimize it, that's ours. Now, take this one out. Simply remove, eject. Okay. Now I'll do yours. I don't know what I'm doing.
And I have it saved in two different PowerPoint versions. I have the old, in case you didn't have the most current version of PowerPoint. I saved it as,
We should have it.
I saved it as a PPT.
And where am I going here?
Oh, go to date modified.
All right.
It should, there we go. And so,
Actually, either one of these will open, but let's get the newer one.
yeah, whatever. Oops.
Gosh, this
Date
mouse
modified.
isn't doing what I want to do. Where's the version?
You went to go to date modified. There you go.
There we go.
Yep, there you go. That one will work.
Is it the top one?
Yes,
Yeah,
that should be
it's the
fine.
top one, okay. And so I
I
will
put
just
it on
open
there
this and I'll
this morning.
minimize it, and then you can just open it and put it on presentation. How's that?
That
Should
sounds
be right.
good.
See, it's right down here.
Oh, and I can just click on it.
Yep. Is that okay?
Yes, except then the only thing is, I rarely use it and
Okay, to get it to a,
to get it where I'm where I'm not
you
in
want to
there.
go? Why? Go to
Okay, so it's not, slideshow, there we
And then
go.
from beginning.
Okay, gotcha. I wrote it, but I haven't used it much.
Right. Okay, no, I don't think there's anything in Word. No, there isn't. Okay, so there's two PowerPoints. And now I need to get your thing out of here safely. Safely remove, eject.
Beautiful.
Say, is currently in use. Oh, I gotta close that, uh-oh. Why did I do that with the other one? Oh, the other one I saved to the hard drive.
Yeah, you can save this.
I'll do
Go ahead
that.
and save it.
Save as. Where did I put the other one? I put it in C, no, I put it in documents,
That's fine.
right there.
There you go.
Save. And now I don't think I need to close it now, because it's now operating off a different system. So let's see if it'll do this. No, I've got to close it and then reopen it. Okay, now,
Hi, how are you? Thanks for coming.
we got a lot of people here.
There's no pressure.
So many people.
Yeah.
Save, eject.
Nice record of it too.
Out of use, out of use.
Thanks for coming.
Wait, why can't we be able to get the documents here?
could just,
Maybe I have to close this one too.
or do you have to close that folder? Because that was all my stuff on that folder. If you go back to the first one, there.
In here?
Yeah, that's all my stuff.
Oh, I see, so if I go to downloads, or I go to documents where the two files are, now we should be all right.
Yes, so now
I
I
see
think
what
we
you're saying, I just
can,
said that over, I shouldn't have done that. Safely remove, eject, there we go.
perfect.
Good thing the expert's here, huh? Right.
My husband's an IT guy,
Yeah.
and he said, "You are putting that on a jump drive, aren't you? Because they won't hook up to a Mac at this."
Is it functioning, Tom?
Oh, yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm just gonna open them both up
Okay.
and minimize them, and so when you wanna open it, you just get down here to here and click on your PowerPoint.
Okay, and are the fellows recording in the other room?
I'll check to make sure.
Okay.
So when you want your PowerPoint, just put the cursor down here and click on your PowerPoint, Byron.
Okay.
See? Put your cursor at the bottom there and click on your PowerPoint.
All right.
I think I'm first up, so I might as well
Okay.
just stay.
And then you can use this to move, and this to open it.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's how you can forward and back on the
Slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll check. Mark's gonna do his first.
That sounds good to me.
Just take a second.
It'd be nice to see somebody else go first.
Okay, we ready to go?
Yep.
Good afternoon. My name's Myron Orfield. I'm a law professor here at the University of Minnesota and the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity. And we've invited today a number of groups in the Twin Cities metropolitan area that have an interest in the evolving Fair Housing Equity Assessment and the Metropolitan Council's new regional housing plan. Many of us are interested and come from a perspective with a deep involvement either in city planning or in civil rights and fair housing. I teach fair housing issues at the university, and I've been recently an advisor to HUD on both the disparate impact rule and the rule, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And many of the interests in this process are to think about civil rights and the possibility of integration. It's particularly fitting to talk about this topic here at the University of Minnesota and in Minnesota, which is one of the country's leading centers in early civil rights progress. Many important civil rights leaders came from the Twin Cities: Roy Wilkins, Clarence Mitchell, many others as well. Hubert Humphrey was the principal floor leader for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Walter Mondale, the chief author of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Many of us are concerned that the issues of racial integration and of housing discrimination are not adequately being discussed in this process. The groups that are going to speak today are people from Minneapolis neighborhoods that would like to comment on the housing plans that have been happening in the last decades and the housing plans that are proposed moving forward. We also have representatives from many racially diverse suburbs in the Twin Cities. Brooklyn Park, Richfield, Oakdale, among many others. And this is, in some ways, a supplement of several other meetings we've had that are on our website, where we had hours of testimony from racially diverse suburbs and school districts about their concerns concerning the housing plan in the past and going forward, concerns about a housing plan that would accelerate and intensify segregation and resegregation in neighborhoods rather than lead to integration. We also have representatives from parent groups, groups that have been involved in the city and in the suburbs in trying to maintain racially integrated schools. Many of our first-ring suburbs, St. Louis Park, Richfield, Robbinsdale, Hopkins, first-ring or fully developed suburbs, have been very proactive in trying to make sure that their schools are racially integrated. Many of these suburban districts have specifically drawn racially integrated boundaries, and that's often very hard to do. That's often controversial. Many of these are concerned that the present housing policy and the housing policy moving forward will undo the work that they have done in trying to maintain integrated boundaries. And finally, we have both of the major NAACP chapters in Minnesota, the Minneapolis NAACP and the Saint Paul NAACP, who have not been involved in the process so far, and I think have many important comments and observations as long-standing advocates for civil rights in the metropolitan area. In some ways, we have felt in the Twin Cities, and this process particularly has been dominated by affordable housing producers who have been building for many years in a very segregated context. They are very large industry. The Metropolitan Consortium for Community Developers has a combined budget of $172 million a year. All of the civil rights groups in the whole metropolitan area, in the whole state, have budgets of less than 1% of that and don't have the advocacy and outreach. Maybe, Tom, can you turn the slides on? I'm just going to show a few slides and we'll get on with the testimony. Nearly 60% of the region's subsidized units, which are disproportionately occupied by minority citizens, are located within the central cities of Minneapolis and Saint Paul, which encompass only about a quarter of the region's population and already hold a very large and disproportionate share of the region's non-white population. In the areas of high concentration of poverty and racial segregation, these neighborhoods have more than 2 times their fair share of subsidized units. And in many of these units, upwards of 20% of the entire units are subsidized units, governmental units, a share that doesn't even come close in other parts of the area. In the last several years, Minneapolis and St. Paul have located more than 85% of all their units in areas of minority concentration. This is much higher than the 68% that was occurring at the time of the Holman versus Cisneros lawsuit. Across the metropolitan area, majority non-white census tracts contain only 10% of the region's housing units, but over 33% of the region's subsidized units. White census tracts, areas that are overwhelmingly white, contain over half of the region's housing, but less than 1/4 of its subsidized units, less than half of their fair share of affordable housing. Many of us today feel that the Metropolitan Council's Fair Housing Equity Assessment is inadequate. First, it does not discuss, as is required by law, the Metropolitan Council's longstanding pro-integrative Policy 39, which was the nation's most integrative policy, fair housing policy, operated in the metropolitan area from approximately 1970 till the mid-'80s. Nor do they discuss the present and existing housing policy plan of 1985, a far-reaching document with rich and complex fair housing principles. This is the existing law. It hasn't been enforced for more than 2 decades, and it's not even discussed in this document. They do not discuss the central city sub-allocators of housing tax credits that were created in the late 1980s. These sub-allocators in the 2 central cities receive from the state about 50% of all of the units and locate them overwhelmingly in poor and segregated areas. It does not discuss the qualified allocation plans that either the State Housing Finance Agency or the sub-allocators operate. These are qualified allocation plans or point systems. In the state's case, providing about 150 points for poor and segregated neighborhoods and only about 10 for racially integrated neighborhoods or majority white neighborhoods. There's an argument that opportunity means transit in the metropolitan area, that if an area has transit, this is opportunity. In our analysis, this isn't true. Many of the places that are most well served by transit have very segregated and unequal schools, have very poor health, have very high crime rates, have very little access to opportunity across the metropolitan area. That most of the areas that are well served by transit, unfortunately, are areas that are not well served by other amenities. It's also been argued that we should put most of the affordable housing in segregated communities because they are close to existing job centers. They are close to existing job centers, but because the Met Council did not include job growth in their characteristics, they are not close to where entry-level jobs are being created in the economy. Even though our poor neighborhoods and our affordable housing is proximate to job centers, these are the places that exhibit the highest levels of unemployment and lack of access. And even though they're proximate, this isn't a good reason to place them there. The groups that are speaking today have sought to be included in this process, have sought to be involved in the shaping of this fair housing equity assessment. And some of us have had some involvement, but largely it has been operated by those that produce affordable housing in poor neighborhoods. And so with that, I think I'd like to, maybe we can just move around and talk about, just go through quickly to say who we are and where we're coming from. I know we have people from HUD here, and they are welcome to ask questions of any of the witnesses or any of the people that would like to speak, and we have people from a variety of other places. So maybe, particularly from the people from HUD, maybe you could identify yourself and just...
Yes, I'm Dexter Sidney, State Director for HUD.
Okay.
I'm Erica Finkler, I work in the Fair Housing Division in HUD. My name is Michelle Smith, I'm the Director of Community Planning and Development.
So I just want to make sure that the HUD people feel comfortable in asking questions to any of the people that are going to testify today. And with that, maybe we can start. The first on our agenda are representatives of Northside neighborhoods of Minneapolis, and our first speaker is Stephanie Groover. And so I leave it to you. Why don't you, just for the record, state your name and spell it, and say where you're coming from.
All right. My name is Stephanie Groover, G-R-U-V as in Victor, E-R. I am a member of the Weber-Camden neighborhood. I've lived there for 18 years. And I work with the Weber-Camden Neighborhood Organization in addition to being a licensed real estate agent with the state of Minnesota and RE/MAX Results. I've put together a PowerPoint today, my best efforts here at technology, to try to summarize some of the information I'm seeing as an on-the-ground, active, engaged realtor in the community. So I'm coming to you today not as a representative of my broker or the local agents association, but as a real estate agent who does 85% of her business in the neighborhoods comprising the 4th Ward of North Minneapolis. Although the foreclosure crisis has diminished, home ownership in North Minneapolis, in my opinion, is still very much at risk. And my hope is HUD can do something to change the future of these neighborhoods. As I said, I wanted to offer a foot-on-the-ground perspective today. And what I'm seeing happening in these communities is the owner-occupied housing stock that's left in the 4th Ward is converting to rental housing stock at an alarming rate. In 2013, 28% of all conversions of owner-occupied homes to rental homes in the entire city of Minneapolis converted in the 4th Ward, the highest conversion rate of any of the 13 wards in the city. Despite down payment assistance programs and other affordable home ownership efforts, homeowners are clearly leaving the 4th Ward. What I noticed recently, after the first quarter of sales in 2014 for the neighborhoods of McKinley, Falwell, Cleveland, and Weber-Camden in the 4th Ward, we had 84 closed home sales. But of those home sales, 68% went to cash buyers who appear to be predominantly investors, with only 14% of the transactions going to FHA buyers, indicating the 4th Ward is once again on track to have the highest number of conversions from owner-occupied to rental homes in the city. But this isn't the amazing part of the story. The amazing part is the city of Minneapolis has identified one out-of-state corporation as being responsible for 30% of all purchases in these 4 neighborhoods for the first quarter of 2014. This corporation's goal, to create a profitable portfolio, of highly profitable rental housing. On the next slide, I wanted to show you, this is a map from the city of Minneapolis. It's the rental conversion list. And let's see if this upper corner here is the neighborhoods that I'm talking about. And you'll see that they are definitely showing the highest transition to non-homestead properties. And my reason for this to be concerned, although HUD's rent subsidy and affordable housing programs appear to have policies to avoid concentrations of poverty, there also appears to be no enforcement of these policies in the 4th Ward or any part of North Minneapolis. Without enforcement, private investors see the potential to have a monthly rent payment of $1,200 or more on a 3 to 4 bedroom house purchased for $80,000 to $120,000, some of the most affordable homes in the Twin Cities metro area. As these homes convert from homesteaded properties to investment vehicles, the opportunity for home ownership, often identified as a key way for working class families to obtain stable housing and accumulate and transfer wealth to future generations, is being converted to a wealth accumulation mechanism for the upper middle class. With the cash purchasing power of these investors, home values are driven down throughout the neighborhood, since investors are typically buying their properties at a 10 to 15% discount because they are cash. So any value gains that are made by a sale to an owner-occupant using traditional financing are quickly offset by other comps from the cash buyer. We came off of a strong owner-occupant-based housing market last spring, and the investors have set in now. And we're going to start seeing these comps hitting the spring market appraisals because the freshest comparable sales in the neighborhood are cash buyer sales predominantly. While these investors are not breaking the law, they are clearly taking advantage of a system that HUD has helped create. In addition to this, I'm seeing redevelopment challenges. In addition to the challenges brought forward from the private market, we have severe challenges for redevelopment due to the depressed values. Whether the development is a multi-unit project on a transit corridor or a new construction home, subsidy dollars are required due to the depressed values. The properties simply will not appraise high enough to cover their own expense in building. These subsidy dollars from federal or state sources almost always have an income restriction tied to them. The problem, income-restricted development subsidy programs dampen the potential of these neighborhoods by limiting the number of consumers who can rent or purchase in these areas. I recently had a house for sale at 4150 Upton Avenue North. I had 5 families, including 2 that wanted to stay in their neighborhood. They specifically wanted a new construction home with 3 bedrooms on 1 level for their growing family. They wanted to transition out of 1.5-story homes. They were ineligible to buy these houses because they made just over $95,000 a year as owner-occupants. They made too much money to buy in a challenged neighborhood. By limiting the full potential of the buyer pool in a rising real estate market, value increases are restrained, which is unfair to surrounding homeowners. I could have sold that house in multiple offers had every buyer who was interested been able to bring an offer to the table. So questions for consideration. While affordable housing is a critical need in any city, why would HUD keep funding income-restricted construction in neighborhoods that already have the most affordable housing and the weakest housing values? Why would HUD allow low-income projects to be built in low-income census tracts or across the street from a low-income census tract? I have an issue with this in that I am being told that a development can go into a neighborhood because it's moderate income, and yet when you cross the street, you cross into a low-income census tract. How is that appropriate? What is HUD doing to make sure the moderate income neighborhoods do not fall to a low income neighborhood status? I'm seeing a transfer of wealth in the community. I'm seeing people leave the community. What are we doing to make sure that moderate income neighborhoods can sustain themselves? How is a working class community supposed to develop a housing market stable enough to stand on its own 2 feet with little to no subsidy dollars if every piece of new construction is income restricted? So my question today is, why is there no effort to break the cycle of dependency on subsidy, or at the very least, greatly reduce it, and bring a balance to the community? We need balance in North Minneapolis. So I think there is an opportunity for change. There's dozens of vacant lots that are available to build single-family homes in North Minneapolis for new construction. There are buyers of all incomes, including current neighborhood residents that are looking for good value in new construction and will consider urban neighborhoods. Why lose these buyers to the suburbs? Because they're allowed to buy out there. These vacant lots could potentially be developed with little to no subsidy if the resale values could support the construction costs, and buyers could obtain FHA, VA, or conventional financing. The problem is, even if I have buyers who are qualified to pay the full construction cost price for a house, we can't get the appraisal because there's no current sales comps to support the cost of the actual construction. Rather than income limit the buyer pool and potentially depress values, why not strategically seed the development of 10 to 15 new homes without income limits to grow sales comps in the area to a point where values would sustain with little or no subsidy at all? Prices will still remain comparatively affordable to other areas of the Twin Cities, yet be healthier overall for the entire neighborhood. So the long-term homeowners who have put in their 20 years are not going to be damaged by undervalued new construction. Final comments. What I see is unless steps are taken to correct these inequities, North Minneapolis will never have a housing market that can stand on its own and will just continue to move forward on a path of disinvestment. I'm asking HUD to review its policies regarding concentrations of poverty to decrease the conversions of single-family homesteaded properties to non-homesteaded investment vehicles. I would like to see working-class families have a chance at home ownership and at wealth accumulation for not only today, but for the future generations. I'm asking HUD to find a way to provide unrestricted development dollars to create a balanced rental and home ownership market for all. My house burned to the ground today. My husband and I could not have a new construction rental unit to rent temporarily while our house was being rebuilt in the neighborhood because there's so few new construction units going in at market rate. Almost everything is subsidized, income restricted. And finally, there is room in North Minneapolis for a broad and diverse spectrum of residents. Why not give everyone a chance and an incentive to be a part of the future of North Minneapolis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can have Julie and Learson. Why don't you stay at the table if you can, and have Julie. Yeah, why don't you come down, and then we'll. I know Jonathan Palmer, I think, is running a little late, so but maybe we can have you both testify and then open for have some questions, if anyone would like to ask questions.
Now, where do I direct my,
I think that
do I need to direct my
You want me to-
voice somewhere, or?
I think that you'll be picked up. There's cameras all over the room, but
Okay.
probably this one will be.
I'm kind of deciding if I'm talking to you all. or-
Yes.
That's
think
why
you
I
can-
just
you
stared
can-
at the screen.
Yeah.
I'm a sheep, so I'm an attorney, so, you know, you get into a law school environment and you feel like,
I remember
is
this
he gonna
myself.
call on me?
No, ma'am.
Did I do my homework?
No, ma'am. Well, maybe you should identify yourself and say where you're coming from, and then go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julianne Learson, and I'm the executive director for the Neighborhood Hub, which is a nonprofit in North Minneapolis. At the Hub I'm a resident of St. Louis Park. I'm glad to see that they are here, and a former North Minneapolis resident. At my organization, our mission is to be a beacon of holistic transformation that fosters a healthy African American community through competent navigation services, leadership development, and advocacy. As I mentioned, I'm an attorney by trade. I grew up in the North Minneapolis Hawthorne neighborhood, which is now the poorest neighborhood in North Minneapolis. With the 2010 census showed a median income of $12,000 in Hawthorne. From the time I was about 15 years old, the heyday of LA law, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer because I thought lawyers were people with power, access, influence, gatekeepers, ability to make change. I knew that I wanted to help the people in the community where I grew up, because I saw that my fellow African Americans were not getting ahead at the same rate as their white counterparts. And so I became an attorney because I care about justice. Fast forward to today, and I'm here representing the residents that we serve daily at my organization. These individuals, who are primarily African American, mostly residents of North Minneapolis, an occasional outlier, but not many, they come through our door seeking a better life. They need help with paying a utility bill, maybe their rent, help finding a job, building a resume, and of course, one of the biggest requests we get is assistance finding affordable housing. When it comes to housing, our clients face daily issues. Housing, they need it, but they can't get it. Maybe they have an eviction on their record. Maybe they have housing, but it's badly in need of repair. Maybe their oven doesn't work, or the refrigerator. Maybe they have bed bugs sharing their residence with them. Or there's mold or lead paint that is making the family sick. These homes are often owned by landlords that own many, many, many properties in North Minneapolis. Some of them own 30, 50, 80 properties on the north side. These landlords are often unscrupulous. They do the minimum to keep their rental licenses, and some of them even write illegal clauses into their leases. So for example, the most egregious example I know of this is people, landlords writing into the lease that you can't call the city inspector, and if you do, you will be evicted. Now, we know that's an illegal clause in this room, but many tenants don't know that. And so when they encounter a problem, they're afraid to call the inspector because they're afraid of retaliation. Many of the clients we serve actually want to leave North Minneapolis. Perhaps they've lived north for their whole lives and they want to change, or perhaps they came from another city, like Chicago, Detroit, Gary. They sought a better life and have found that North Minneapolis doesn't look much different than where they came from. In fact, we know that according to, and I can leave this with somebody, I have one copy of this. This is a study that the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Foundation and Wilder Foundation did in 2010. It's called The Unequal Distribution of Health in the Twin Cities. We refer to it in my agency as death by zip code. It shows that North Minneapolis zip codes 55411 and 55412 can expect, residents in those neighborhoods can expect to live 8 to 9 years less. 8 to 9 years less than their counterparts in more affluent communities such as Eden Prairie and Wayzata, right here in the metropolitan area. Unfortunately, for those seeking affordable housing outside the central cities, there's scarcity of government subsidized housing in so-called nicer, safer suburban neighborhoods. Even more unfortunate, some might say egregious, is that HUD seems to have allowed a set of practices to continue that will guarantee this lack of choice into the future. Without proactive efforts, we cannot hope for much improvement for a community that was designated by the city in 1935, the city of Minneapolis that is, as a Negro slum. And I also brought 20 copies of these maps. So these are city planning maps, which I will hand out, from 1935 that show a good portion of the community we're talking about was designated as a slum. And it's Negro section, largest in the city. And I've been I will say, a little aside on this map, I've received pushback on this occasionally, that it's a description rather than a prescription. And my response is, in what universe do we consider the word slum anything other than pejorative? So whether it was descriptive or prescriptive, the effect is the same. There's plenty of data that shows that children perform better in integrated school settings. Professor Orfield has a study, the Isaiah organization did a study also in the last couple of years in the Twin Cities metropolitan area that shows integrated schools are better, you get better outcomes, more kids graduate, more kids go to college, etc. When neighborhoods are segregated, schools are segregated. I'm a product of the Minneapolis public school system, and I had a recent revelation that we were taught by hippies, but that it really actually made a difference in how the school, what our education looked like, and how integrated our schools were. In a state where we see so it affects achievement gap is my point. When you have segregation and those schools aren't as well-performing, and we keep talking about this achievement gap, really what we mean is an opportunity gap for some of our kids. In a state where we see the lowest graduation rate for Black kids in the country. And I know you all are local here, but I just want to remind us, it's the lowest graduation rate for Black kids in the nation. Minnesota has the dubious honor. We cannot ignore the effect that housing policy has on this. In fact, recent data shows Minnesota may be the worst place in the country for Black people to live. The statistics show that we have some of the worst unemployment rates, which I've heard upward of 20% in this community we're talking about, North Minneapolis. We have worse graduation rates, some of the worst health disparities, and some of the highest incarceration rates for African Americans in the nation, right here in Minnesota. Much of this is driven, again, by where people live and what services they have access to, and amenities, and businesses, and jobs. It is the affordable housing policy as it stands currently has not just allowed, but in fact has promoted concentrated poverty to the point where it is virtually now self-perpetuating. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits the use of government funding of racially segregated programs and activities. Yet in the Twin Cities, we see a trend of resegregating our metropolitan areas into haves and have-nots. Metropolitan area. The city and schools are much, much more segregated than the environment I grew up in the 80s. Section 8 funding and affordable housing projects have been allowed to proliferate in certain communities like North Minneapolis and Phillips neighborhood on the south side. These communities are actually the reverse of the areas of opportunity that is prescribed under the Fair Housing Act from 1968. In other words, communities that are already racially integrated and or are areas of concentrated poverty are the same communities that continue to receive funding for more affordable housing projects. The state of Minnesota and the Met Council have an obligation to promote integration in housing according to the Fair Housing Act, and HUD has an obligation to enforce it. Yet we see local suburban communities being denied access to affordable housing dollars and projects to the benefit of real estate developers, both nonprofit and for-profit, that want to keep their building projects in the city. And I think reflecting on that a little bit, many developers perceive city as an easier sell. You're not going to get as much guff from the neighbors if you try to, although they obviously haven't seen North Vent Facebook page, so I think that it seems to be the road less or the path of least resistance in a lot of cases. And then you have, because there is a lot of backlash from neighbors when you try to put this in suburban communities particularly. But it's not working. We have to stop this. So we're here, we being my organization on behalf of these residents, to ask that HUD demand compliance from Minnesota units of government, including the state of Minnesota, the Met Council, and whatever relevant counties and cities participate. So Hennepin County is probably the biggest recipient of these funds. Where's the compliance and where is the enforcement? We need a system that will allow affordable housing to be distributed through the metropolitan area in a way that our esteemed statesman Walter Mondale described as replacing segregated neighborhoods with truly integrated and balanced living patterns. America's promise is equal opportunity and protection for all. We must do more than pay lip service to these lofty ideals if we are to see a reduction in stratification and an improvement in the lives of the most disadvantaged in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a few questions, and then I think maybe we can open it up a little bit. But one of the things that people say about the housing policy, about concentrating affordable housing in poor neighborhoods, is that it builds those markets, that the housing policy, that building such a large share of subsidized housing and tax credit units, that improves the market conditions in those neighborhoods. It stimulates private market investment. Give me a sense of your experience on the ground. Is that an accurate statement? Is it partly true, a little bit true?
I would say that at times it can be very helpful to starting to rebuild a market. I think that there's real value. And I also think that there's real value in having units that are available to the low to moderate income households so that they do have the opportunity to achieve home ownership. But there gets to a point, especially when you're in a housing market recovery that we're at, where we're seeing the values rising, and it's now to the point where there's multiple buyers for houses, and there's people interested in considering the city and the location. And there's nothing for them, you know, you're limiting the buyer pool. By restricting the buyer pool, you're actually going to create a place where you're not necessarily going to see that rise.
And how are they, who's restricting the buying pool? How is it being restricted?
Well, most of the funding that I've seen for these projects, and I come here today having represented and continue to represent both for-profit and nonprofit developers as a listing agent. What I hear, what my clients tell me basically is that, the federal funds, the state funds, they come with income restrictions. So according to how the funding stream that's used to build the project itself is going to dictate who can buy. And I think a better pattern would be, and there was a program about 10 years ago that did this, is you build the structure and say, look, if someone that makes this much is interested in living in this neighborhood, we can help them by using down payment assistance as a subsidy. The Humboldt Greenway in North Minneapolis was developed in this way, where they built market rate housing, but if a buyer of a specific income level came forward, they were given an interest-free, deferred payment loan and it was a significant amount, I think it was up to $40,000 to assist them with buying the house. So they could achieve home ownership in that community, and yet it didn't, to anyone else, the comp sale prices were there. So it was a down payment assistance methodology versus, here's your pool of funds, this is the only pool of buyers that are going to be eligible for buying this.
You have a sense of this too? Has the market been built by affordable housing being built there? Is it?
Well, whether it's a positive, I think with me, this has been it's kind of a thorny issue because you don't want to be keeping people from living in communities where they want to live.
Exactly.
But I don't see the prosperity in North Minneapolis. I see that, I cited the Hawthorne neighborhood as the lowest median income of $12,000. And there are many neighborhoods in North Minneapolis where the median income is less than $20,000 annually. And I know that that was a different neighborhood. The lowest one was the Jordan neighborhood. So what I see happening is a lot of shifting around. There aren't a lot of community-owned businesses, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. One is safety. One may have to do with licensing through the city. But there's the community is vulnerable in the sense that sort of anybody who wants to come in and make a buck in a small business, real estate, they're targeting North Minneapolis. So you have a lot of little businesses where the owners don't have any real investment in the community, and we don't see sort of the wide breadth of services available also that's available in a community where I live in St. Louis Park, where I can walk out my door and point my car 2 miles in any direction and find a coffee shop, where if I need to send a FedEx, a health club, make a photocopy, these types of basic services that we often consider to be basic services in a suburban community, they're not available in North Minneapolis. So if affordable housing is building market, I must be missing something.
One of the things I think too, people argue that this affordable housing is better to have the well-managed subsidized housing that non-for-profits build rather than have the speculators and the rotten landlords, that they're really protecting you from the speculators and rotten landlords by building all of these nice new buildings that are well managed and they're safer and better. Even if they're not building the market, perhaps they're making living conditions better. What about that?
Well, I am loath to throw darts at a nonprofit because I would run one.
And I used to work for one.
However, I will say that I think we see that there is a better standard in terms of development and practices, but there are still problems in those systems. The recent fire with the children, where the 5 children died, that property was owned by a nonprofit company. And there's been a lot of back and forth about whether it's up to code or not, and whether the other property is up to code. But there's still a lot of questions around that. There are too many speculators and developers, there's no doubt about that. But in my opinion, one of the things that's happened is we see that we have a lack of cost control. That seems to be driven by the actual housing policy, where there's not a incentive to control your costs, so that it becomes a moneymaker for a nonprofit in many cases. And the other issue I have, again, not throwing darts at nonprofits, but when you keep putting nonprofit housing developments up, you begin to lose your tax base. And so, if we don't pay taxes as a nonprofit organization, then we're not paying property taxes. Eventually, you're going to sort of deplete the value of the whole community.
Myra,
Yes,
if I may?
sure.
My issue is not necessarily with the nice new rental developments. My issue is that I'd like to see some balance brought forward with these developments. If you've got 45 units going in on a corridor in a very low-income census tract, why are we seeing, such heavy weight towards, income restricted? I mean, literally, there was a development being proposed, and someone on Facebook said, oh, they have 1 unit of market rate housing for the caretaker of the building. 1 unit. Why isn't there, and I look at South Minneapolis, and I look at, there was a development that went in and it had 50-some units, and I think the income mix, it was more like 30 or 40% of that development was income restricted, affordable housing based. So how is this, and I have to tell you, I honestly don't think most residents of North Minneapolis who sit on neighborhood boards, and it's no slight to my colleagues on neighborhood boards across North Minneapolis, but this low-income housing tax credit scoring system, I mean, I have a college degree. I can barely figure out how this thing works. It is not an easy system, and how it's weighted. And I mean, it just feels like there's no common sense to this process. And I think that's one reason I have found your work so interesting. Because it just seems like it's a mystery to the ordinary resident.
One last question before we open it up. One of the things that people say is that that neighborhoods, in very poor neighborhoods, really want the lion's share of affordable housing. They want to have most of the affordable housing in the region built in these neighborhoods, that it helps preserve culture and community strength, that it is a bad thing to be building affordable housing in white neighborhoods or other parts of the metropolitan area. That most of the opposition, if there is any at all in poor neighborhoods, it's by older white families that really are not interested in, have biases, racial biases or feelings that are unfair or not magnanimous toward people of color. Does that seem like, does that reflect people's opinion, do you think? Are the civil rights, is the civil rights perspective about racial integration, is this just a bunch of pointy-headed claptrap that really doesn't relate to neighborhoods?
You want me to take
Yeah.
that first? Okay,
Read on that one.
pointy-headed claptrap. I mean, I had some reservation coming here because I don't consider myself to be, I don't consider my position to be that to promote integration. I think there are a lot of people of my generation, or Generation X, African Americans, who will frankly say, I don't care, I don't need to live near white people, I'm fine with that. But you better not tell me that I can't. And, you know, there's definitely some validity in keeping cultural groups together for the sake of, but I think that has to be driven by community desire. Those residents desire to stay in community with one another, not some systemic design that forces them into that community with one another. And in the state of Minnesota, we have low numbers of people of color. It is, to me, it's absurd that we should have such segregated communities as these when our numbers are so low as communities of color. We can't, this is not Atlanta, this is not Washington, D.C. There's no way we're gonna set up a entire suburb and metropolitan area where, you know, I remember going to Atlanta and seeing that for the first 2 days, I didn't see a white face. And that's not the case in Minnesota.
I'm gonna turn this phone off.
Is that your phone ringing?
Yeah, somebody was listening distantly, but,
Probably needs to come back.
yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So I think that the system is sort of pitting people against one another in these neighborhoods, is my honest opinion. There's a real lack of understanding from all residents about what this policy does, how it's intended to work, and how it actually plays out are two different things. I don't think people understand how it's supposed to be working. And I think the residents in North Minneapolis who are on the up and up and doing what they're supposed to do, they don't want more crime in their communities, they don't want more property values coming down. But I think the system sort of sets it up to be very divisive, and but I mean, personally, I live in a pretty integrated suburb, and I like the fact that my kid went to school in a place where 25-30% of the kids were other kids of color, but where she had really good opportunity educationally in a school that was rated a top school by the state many times. So.
The people from HUD, you have the first priority to ask questions if you'd like to, otherwise we'll just, go ahead. You have a question in the back?
Yeah, so I was gonna ask a question and then, so one, I think we should problematize conversations. Does anybody in this room live in North Minneapolis? I do as well, right? So the largest group of people talking about a community.
Is this a comment or a question?
It's going to be a question, yeah. And then, but I also want to make sure that there's facts. I live in North Minneapolis. There is an Anytime Fitness within a mile of my house, and there's a print shop. And I know Julian, so we're friends. So I'm not trying to call you out, but to say there's not a Lifetime Fitness, to say there's not a amenities can be misleading, and for a group of people who don't live in North Minneapolis, I think we should be careful about the narrative we're creating about that place. My question is, where I live, in my little pocket of the Jordan neighborhood, actually benefits from a housing pattern that is market rate home ownership, rental with good
Is this do you have a
landlords.
question?
I'm about to get to the question yet. And then,
This is, I think one of the things that, one of the reasons we're having the hearing today is because civil rights proponents have been shut out of the process entirely. And we don't want statements, we'd like you to participate, but there have been dozens of hours of hearings that we haven't been allowed to come to. And
so I'll ask my question.
Yeah.
So realizing the benefit of the mixed type of housing that exists in my community, would both of you say that we're in an either-or situation for where affordable housing should be built, or a both-and?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the point in what I tried to come across in my presentation is what I would like to see is balance and opportunity for all, because we have too many. To your point, there are new businesses coming in. You know, there's the Lowry Cafe on Lowry. There's Anytime Fitness. The Camden community, which is the farther edge of North Minneapolis, lost a grocery store 10 years ago, and everybody wants a grocery store. We can't get another independent grocer or small grocery to come in because nobody's willing to take the risk. Nobody's willing to try it. There has been talk over and over again about, could we get a Trader Joe's? No, the demographics aren't there. The income demographics aren't there. No one has to leave, but we need a more of a balance, in my opinion. And if we don't get to a balance, we're never going to solve the vacant storefront problem, because we do have a number of vacant storefronts. 42nd and Thomas, vacant. 42nd and Fremont, vacant. I've been in a lot of the commercial buildings throughout even West Broadway, in Camden, a lot of them are so disinvested. You know, 42nd and Fremont sits a beautiful, classic 1920s retail space. But it's going to take $250,000 to $300,000 to renovate that space into a usable, functional space, and the top rents are $9 a square foot. No investor's going to touch it because they can't make any money at it. And we need some balance. And I don't foresee North Minneapolis turning into Southwest Minneapolis. It would be nice if we could have a little bit of a balance so that maybe we could get a little bit like Northeast, or a little bit back to what we had. When I moved in 18 years ago, there was a grocery store, a bakery, a drugstore, a coffee shop. We had a lot of these businesses in and around, another hardware store, and they've disappeared. And nothing is really replacing them. I mean, it's one of the things I hear the most from people when I take them out and I put them in the car and they say, well, where do you shop? Well, you can go to Aldi's or you can go to Cub on Broadway. Okay, where else do you shop? Is there a co-op? No. Okay. Where do you go to lunch? Well, you can go to Emily's Cafe, or you can go to Victory 44, or you can go to Lowry Cafe. Well, what do you do for nightlife? There's no nightlife. You know, there's no place you can hang out until 10 o'clock as a coffee shop, at least not north of Lowry anymore. So, you know, part of this housing policy, I think, is getting a concentration of enough people where we can actually support some local businesses as well. And that'll also create some jobs. Do you agree?
I don't want to get yelled
We have another question. Now let's have questions and not. We've had lots of opportunities for the low-income housing community to testify and really dominate this process. We'd be happy to have questions, but we've had lots of testimony. Go ahead.
Okay, couple questions. What about the income? Nobody's talking about the income levels that are needed to bring this housing up, and there's nothing coming into those neighborhoods that bring the wages up. So the people that are there may place. So is there going to be income, and you're going to do that, or are living wage jobs? You badmouth the nonprofits because I work at one.
Well, and I did work for one.
I do. I still work at one.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we have a project going on, and it only has 6 to 7 subsidized.
You have a question?
Yeah. The question is, how do you make the point that people don't want to live where they live? I mean, they made place. I mean, it's their place.
I think for me, so when I read Professor Orfield's study, I felt emotionally I was devastated by it. I looked at it and I said, how can this be in my city? How can this be in my state? How can this be the community where I grew up? And what I saw is that there's a lack of options for people who have low incomes. So middle class people of color aren't generally living in these communities unless they're of a certain generation. But which is baby boomers, there's still a lot of middle class families in North Minneapolis that are the baby boomers that are people of color. But what I see is particularly African Americans, Somalis, Latinos are choosing, if they're in middle class, they're choosing to live in a suburban community because they don't feel the same quality of life and in this community. And then you have people who have low incomes who don't have that same choice to live in those other communities.
But what can be done without devastating the community? That's what we're asking. What are you going to do about the present situation that's there, and it's been there since at least 1935? What are you going to do about that? Right. When it wasn't the people's fault that did that. It was the state, the city, and the local government.
That's right.
Right.
So what are you going to do about that?
I would like to add one thing. I think the nonprofit developers, many of them are doing extraordinary work in North Minneapolis. But what I'm saying is the income streams are limiting their ability, the funding streams are limiting what they can accomplish. And it's not, and I'd like to see them have more options to do varieties of housing and balance of housing.
But you're limiting them. See, because there's 17 market rate to every one affordable housing and this is true. So what you're doing is saying, oh, well, we're gonna build all this housing and nobody's gonna be able to afford it. That's in that neighborhood. Come on now.
Interesting.
Why don't we, are there any questions besides housing advocates? Are there any citizens who aren't housing advocates that have a question? Okay, we're all housing advocates. Part of the status quo. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Me,
Yeah.
Michelle Sims. How would you describe the difference between segregation and integration? And then also, how do you see the health equity piece playing into housing?
I'm not going to touch the segregation versus integration. I mean, there's this dictionary definition of it, and I'm not here to advocate for integration in and of itself.
I understand that.
I am here because we see what the results are in a segregated community.
Right.
In terms of health outcomes, the study that I will pass on to Professor Orfield, again, reviewing for those who weren't here, this shows that this was commissioned by Blue Cross and Blue Shield Foundation to 2010 unequal distribution of housing in twin cities. It shows that 55411 and 12, which are North Minneapolis zip codes, have about an 8 to 9 year less life expectancy than their counterparts in a suburb like Eden Prairie or Minnetonka. But what's more interesting to me, and what we actually do work on this in my organization, that's the other reason I'm here, is it looks not just at healthcare, but it looks at other factors. And we call them upstream social factors. So, social inequities. How does that, and what we're talking about are things like education, employment, income, family and social support, and community safety. When those things are less in a community, there are many studies, including this one, Woodruff Johnson Foundation has also done several, that show that 50% of people's health is those factors. So it's not just your health care. So when we have a community that has, albeit growing amenities, but not as good as the suburbs. I mean, to me, it's ridiculous how many coffee shops I can drive to within a mile of my house in St. Louis Park. God, who needs that many coffee shops, right? But when you don't have those, where you have a lot of your male residents may be incarcerated, you have a lot of people in child protection, you have low employment rates, low income, people are sick. It makes people sick. And if we don't do something, literally, physically ill. So that's a huge important factor in the success of the community, is that these things actually contribute to poor health. And that's why we have the lower life expectancy in these neighborhoods.
When I brought up the segregation versus integration piece, it wasn't a battle between, white versus black. It's that a lot of times when people see black people, white people, etc., living in an area together, they think, well, it's integrated. But while the visuals, they may look like it's integrated because different people, colors of people are there, but you can still, you can look at that and it's, in living in that community, whether, just like you said with the health things, it still could be segregated, because when you integrate something, then everybody's working together, the community is healthy. That's what the aspect I was coming from.
Good, maybe we can move on to have some older suburban, fully developed, diverse suburban testimony. And then maybe we stick around if you feel like you want to, and I'm sure people would like to engage and talk to you further separately. We have 3 presenters, thank you, from the first ring suburbs, from some of the most racially diverse suburbs of the metropolitan area, from Brooklyn Park, from Richfield, from Oakdale. And we have Jamie Verbrugge, who's the city manager of Brooklyn Park, John Stark, who is the community development director of Richfield, and Bob Streeter from Oakdale. Are you the community development director too, Bob?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't you guys, if there's any technical needs you need, or otherwise, you could get started in whatever order.
You're closest, Bob. You go first.
work for you.
You gonna go first?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you just state your name and spell it and say where you're from?
Okay, my name's Bob Streeter. It's Streetar. I currently work for the city of Oakdale. I've worked for the city of Columbia Heights, and I also work for the city of Minnetonka, and I live in northeast Minneapolis. One of the things that I wanted to touch on after I read the Met Council's report and your report, and I don't pretend to be even remotely knowledgeable on the things that are going on in these racially concentrated areas of poverty. However, what came to my mind is the inner ring suburbs, and if nothing changes, and with the increase in minority population expected to be around 40%, we're going to be having the same conversation in 10 years about the inner ring suburbs. In fact, we're already doing it now. Some of the research that I have done shows that between 1980 and 2010, with the exceptions of the communities of Golden Valley and Edina, most, if not all, suburbs have seen a significant amount of disinvestment, and in many of those, that disinvestment is accelerating. And that's important because I know we're talking about race barriers, but on the socioeconomic side, where race and income are highly correlated, without the reinvestment in the inner ring suburbs, whether it's addressing physical wear and tear or functional obsolescence, this housing is going to become most affordable, and we're going to see the issue of concentrated poverty, which I experienced, when I was working in Columbia Heights, and areas of concentrated race expand into the first ring or the inner ring suburbs. And so that's what brings me here today, is sort of thinking about the future, and that if we don't change what we're doing, we're going to be talking about the same issue in 10 years, except it's going to be broader. So one of the things that, working in a city is to come up with a set of potential ideas or strategies to try to get at this. And I think I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple. I think first, I think every census tract should be assessed and evaluated with regard to its racial barriers and its socioeconomic status as a way to get at the likelihood that it is an emerging area of concentrated poverty and race and concentrated poverty. I think secondly, somebody said earlier, is it either or both and? And I think in the Met Council report, they have the yellow, the green, and the blue area. And I don't think it's that cut and dried. I think it's far more nuanced. But I think we should identify tracts that are concentrated in terms of poverty and race. And I quite frankly don't think any more additional affordable housing ought to be there at some level, whether it's the definition currently used or something different. I think we ought to focus on a mix, and I think we can get at that by understanding which suburbs, where suburban tracts rank. And I think the Met Council could do that, and I've done some of that in the research that I've done. I think when we identify where we want the affordable housing to go, then whether it's HUD or the Met Council or MHFA, the low-income housing credit scoring, that all of that can be readjusted to direct investment to certain areas and away from other areas. I also think the flip side of that is that we ought to direct more market rate housing into areas that are either, concentrated in terms of poverty or race or emerging. And I think it was said by the last two speakers that if you want those kind of services, the Anytime Fitness, the coffee shops, they're not coming unless there's a market. So I think if we want a market and we want to have that kind of opportunity, we need to create a market. I think the last thing that I'll just say for now is in inner suburbs, particularly in Oakdale, we're beginning to see this transition. In 2000, we were about 92% white, and in 2010, I think we're about 79. And I think Columbia Heights is around 65. So we're beginning to see the areas of concentrated poverty, not so much race, but concentrated poverty. And I think we have to get at that by looking at tracts, maybe even down to the block group, and promoting housing and reinvestment, looking at the amenities and disamenities that exist. Because as I looked at this issue, we've been solving and focusing on solving a shelter problem for 30 or 40 years. And working for a city, we look at the city, but we also look at the neighborhood. So I think where this is expanding is not just what kind of housing do we want, but what kind of place do we want to live in. And I think there are minimums we need in the places we live. They can be different. Some may be a little more diverse than others, but they're all going to have a minimum level of opportunity. And I think we need to start focusing on developing strong neighborhoods. Housing is one component rather than just focusing on the affordable housing or the park or the education. Because in the end, the way, at least I look at it, is you can either disperse poverty, you can dilute poverty, or you can work with the folks who are there to lift them out of poverty. And I think our policy focus has to be on all three of those.
All right, thanks. My name is John Stark. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Ridgefield. I've been there since 1998. Prior to that, I worked for the City of South Bend, Indiana. So a few of the things I'm going to say might be repetitive, but I do think it's important to reinforce these kind of recurring observations. First, just a little bit about Ridgefield. I would say Ridgefield is suburban only when you define it by organization. We're not a part of the City of Minneapolis government. If you look at almost any other metric of what an urban place looks like, we're really an urban community and have more in common with central city demographics than we do with suburban. We're a very homogeneous community, which poses challenges to us. Right now, our housing, about 29% of our housing is considered affordable. I'm sorry, 29% of our home households are considered to be in the affordable range, but only 1% of our households are above 120% of the area median income. So one of these repetitive issues that everybody keeps coming back to is balance. One of the things that Ridgefield really needs, and I think is paramount to just being a healthy community, is a mix of incomes in that community. One of the things that maybe makes Ridgefield a little different than a lot of other communities is our large percentage of the Latino population. By census standards, in the last census, 18% of our population identified itself as Latino. We think that that's very underreported. A lot of households aren't comfortable putting out the information about their heritage. We think it's probably more accurate to look at the schools. 37% of our students are Latino. We think that's probably more reflective of our community. So some of my observations, as I said, mixed income is paramount. We feel like mixed income is really disincented under current programs. In particular, the low-income housing tax credit. When you look over history at the projects that get awarded low-income housing tax credits, very, very, very few of those are mixed income. You're going to score more points in their system if you have a 100% affordable project. And we think that's a policy that needs to change. And that's one of the most visible programs, but there are many other programs in the point systems that we use that award for having affordable housing in isolation. And that gets to my second point, that communities really need to have a recognition of their existing affordable housing, both in terms of policy evaluation, and again, for example, the Metropolitan Council, when they award grants on development projects, will look at the amount of affordable housing that you're bringing in. I think that they ought to really take another look at the amount of affordable housing that you currently have, and that should be given some points in their system as well, not just the new. But also the recognition of affordable housing needs to take place in terms of rehab. Almost all the conversations I ever hear about affordable housing are talking about quantity. What's the percentage? What are the numbers? Nobody's talking about the quality of affordable housing, and that's a much more important conversation to be having. In Ridgefield, as I said, we're about 29% affordable. 1% of our housing units are subsidized. So the other 28% are what we call naturally occurring affordable. In a lot of cases, this just means that it's run down to the point that the only rents that can be charged are affordable rents, and that is a shame. And there really are very few programs out there, none that Richfield has ever been able to utilize, that help a community increase the quality of its existing affordable housing. Another important thing to consider, and again this has been touched on, is that the vitality of a community, not only its housing, but the vitality of the commercial aspects of a community are very important. And without a community retaining that vitality or viability, it risks becoming an undesirable community. And it also, commercial redevelopment, office redevelopment are necessary to bring in the wages that people have talked about. So I think in the state of Minnesota, redevelopment, and really all over the country, redevelopment took a big hit with changing laws about eminent domain. And my fear is that in 10 years, the legislature will look at communities around Minnesota and say, why are there so many run-down commercial areas? And the answer is going to be because we don't have the tools to redevelop them. Fourth, we really need to work, at least in Richfield, on Latino outreach, and that's a couple of different things. One is it's enforcement. There's predatory lending going on out there, and I can tell you that that's evidenced by the disparate foreclosure rates and when you look at the interest rates people have. So there's predatory lending. I believe that there's redlining, and if you talk to the realtors in town, I know that they're steering. And I think those are practices that have to stop. We also need to work on communication with the Latino community. And it's not so much having college students coming out of university, fluently speaking Spanish. It's understanding the culture. And just as an example, Richfield, like a lot of communities, have first-time homebuyer assistance programs. And we were having very poor participation in the Latino community. We had much of our materials, our printed materials, translated. What we didn't understand is that in our first-time homebuyer assistance program is what a pejorative word assistance is in the Latino culture. It might be the way that the word is translated, or it might just be the word in general. And so you throw a word out there that's kind of like a hand grenade, not knowing that that's the case. And so we need to better understand the community. And then the last thing I'm going to say is, most of the communities that are in here have a common set of issues, and we probably need to do a better job. I'm sure we need to do a better job of getting together, of being together, being united, and gaining some political power. When you look at the election maps in Minnesota, it always looks like a big donut, with the outer ring suburbs being a voting block, and then all of rural Minnesota and the inner ring suburbs and cities being a different voting block, yet somehow the donut keeps winning. So, we need to find ways of getting together and enforcing each other. So, that's...
Thank you. Jamie Verbrugge, City Manager in Brooklyn Park. There's a common theme between the three of us because I happen to live in Richfield and I was raised in Columbia Heights, so we keep talking about these same communities over and over again. In these forums, I think Brooklyn Park's story has been relatively well documented in terms of the transition over the last 2 decades with our demographic change. And we've also seen the issues identified in the Choice, Place, and Opportunity Report from the Metropolitan Council, formerly the Fair Housing Equity Assessment. It could have been a documentary report on the city of Brooklyn Park in terms of the complex social issues that are associated with concentrations of race and poverty. And as we've started to talk about this issue with our city council, we're trying to look at those areas where we can locally begin to influence some of these complex social issues. But there's a broad recognition of our city council that our influence and our ability to have local impact is not very substantial compared to the Metropolitan Council and MFHA and some of the other actors in this regard, that we can that we can try to make some inroads where we can. But more importantly, it's going to be to influence the policies that the others set. And I appreciate what John had to say in terms of the donut and the ring, in trying to bring the two together, because frankly, the equity issue and the economic success of the entire region depends on communities like ours to continue to be successful, because the financial consequence to other communities is that they're going to end up subsidizing through public policy continued disinvestment, I think, rather than what some would argue is investment in our communities, because it is continuing a pattern of concentration. We had a number of challenges in our community over the last 5 years that forced the council several years back to approach their staff and say, you know, following that definition of insanity, that continuing to do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, clearly hasn't been working in Brooklyn Park's case when it came to crime and disinvestment and neighborhood instability. And so they asked us to completely overhaul the way we were doing things, which we did. And you know, we've since had to invest a lot of public money, more than $1 million, in a lot of areas that cities haven't normally been invested in on an annual basis to try and combat some of those issues. Well, if you take that example and you expand it to the regional area, you can already see it in practice through the Fiscal Disparities Program, where the net receipt for Brooklyn Park has more than doubled in the last 6 or 7 years because of the ramifications of past policies that continue to reinforce concentrations of race and poverty that cause our tax base to continue to decline at a rate greater than other communities, and when we're starting to rebound, to not recover at a rate as great as what other communities are experiencing. So what's happening is the region is already subsidizing. These communities in the outer ring are already subsidizing the effect of past policy. And so again, to double down on past policy and expect that it's going to have different results is wrong-headed thinking. I think in terms of the Met Council's report, the thing that I would ask of HUD is that they look at the commitments that the Metropolitan Council has made and simply ask the question of whether those commitments are firm enough in terms of public policy. That when I see language that says we will explore the use of its authority, that doesn't sound very firm to me. And there are other issues that were identified in the FHEA, such as steering, such as mortgage lending discrimination, where some of the next steps, I think, are pretty silent on where the exploration of the use of the Met Council's authority would be wholly appropriate to initiate whether those and to what extent those practices were occurring, and to make sure that there are remedies for it. And also to make sure that there are provisions in place to prevent its future utilization. Now, I have been participating in the Housing Policy Working Group, and I am encouraged. I'm cautiously optimistic. I believe that the Met Council staff and the members of the body, the Met Council body, I believe that they are committed to the issue of equity, and that they are looking at ways that the policies can reflect what is pretty clearly needed in terms of public policy that's going to eliminate disparities. And so I think that it's important that that work be adopted and that it be moved forward to make sure that there is less concentration, that there's more opportunity for other communities to be developing affordable housing. One of the concepts that we talked about was having varying incentives depending on the characteristics of a community. For a community like Brooklyn Park or Richfield or Columbia Heights or even Oakdale, some of these other communities where you're starting to see greater concentrations, to suggest that one, the existing conditions in terms of poverty, but also the existing conditions in terms of naturally occurring affordable housing, suggests that there should be future requirements for affordable housing, is again doubling down on past policy that doesn't make sense for the future. And so we need to make sure that that impact is being shared and that responsibility is being shared throughout the metro region.
Thank you. One of the things that I think that those from the civil rights perspective note is Richfield schools are 37% Latino, but almost 80% non-white and poor. Brooklyn Park's schools, particularly in the inner part, many of them are 100% non-white and poor. And we're going to be talking about schools in a minute. But Richfield and Brooklyn Park have historically had the highest suburban goals to produce affordable housing. So many times the goals of a Minnetonka, which 95% white, or in Edina, 95% white. Is this an issue? Is this important? I mean, is Richfield or Brooklyn Park or Oakdale, another place that has pretty high goals? What about that? Is it sensible to leave off the whiter communities? Should they not have goals? Should they be able to just free ride on the system?
Personally, I think the goals ought to be incremental.
Yeah.
The goals ought to be, every community needs to add 2% or 3% or 5%, rather than just having a number out there that's applied.
I think if you ask the city council members in Brooklyn Park that question, you'd resoundingly hear them say, no, that doesn't make sense. And again, this is an area that I'm encouraged, because the discussions that we're having in the working group, I think, are acknowledging that there needs to be greater consideration for the naturally occurring affordable housing, for the level of affordable housing that already exists. But it was a significant point of contention back in 2006, 2007, 2008, having that conversation about what our share of the responsibility was when we already had some of the greatest concentration of affordable housing to begin with. And frankly, I think that's the biggest takeaway from the report that the Metropolitan Council did, and suggests that that sort of a policy doesn't make sense if you want to ensure the regional success for equity and for income equalization.
If there is a ring of suburbs that are on the outside, this blue ring in the Met Council's policy, where you have 50% of all the households, and they have roughly half their fair share of affordable housing, and there's nothing that's going to redress that. They'll always have a lower share. Does that have any effect on existing communities? If you have newly developing communities that are growing, that have very low poverty in their schools, and they never have to come close to their share, does that have any effect on the Brooklyn Parks? Or is it you have to compete with them in any sense for middle-class residents and businesses?
Yeah, we absolutely do in Brooklyn Park. We just had a realtors forum, and the quality of schools was identified by the realtors attending the forum as the biggest barrier to getting people to look at our community. And so the correlation of school performance and school quality to race and poverty is a significant barrier for us.
I just want to add too, and I mentioned earlier, I think that red, green, blue sort of classification, and needs to be more nuanced, because Oakdale's a blue community, and within 3/4 of a mile you're in East Saint Paul. So we need to get to the track level and be more sophisticated in how we look at neighborhoods. That's a really 10,000-foot level.
Okay. Any questions from the audience that would like to ask? Stephanie, go ahead.
I'm curious what you're seeing for investor activity in converting single-family homes to rentals.
So in Brooklyn Park, when I arrived there in 2008, we had just seen a boom in conversions, where we'd gone from about 600 to about 1,200, and we're now at 2,200 single-family rental units out of a total of 25,000 units, and about 22,000 single-family units. And then the outside investor that was referenced earlier has already purchased 80 homes in Brooklyn Park.
80 houses?
Yeah. And their stated intent is that they're going to buy 1,000 in the metro region. it's a hedge fund operated investment plan. And that's going to continue to have a destabilizing impact on our neighborhoods just because of the correlation of pride and ownership for property maintenance and other issues that goes along with that. And that's not a pejorative, that's an observation that we've seen in terms of how we serve the community and the challenges, especially from a code enforcement perspective, of having to work with renter-occupied units. And so that number is going to continue to grow in Brooklyn Park. And here's the other impact from a public policy perspective is that people who are buying those properties for investment purposes who don't have a stake in the community then are going to continue to challenge some of our local decisions, such as our property valuations. That organization is contesting the valuation of half of those 80 properties at our Board of Appeal this month.
And they're going to hit your comps.
Absolutely.
Tim, go ahead.
Oakdale went up from like 350 to over 600 rentals over the last 3 years. Same thing.
Yeah, and we've had similar kinds of things.
Maybe, Tim, you can ask a question. Maybe from now on, we should just, when you're asking a question, just identify who you are and then ask your question.
Tim Thompson, there have been reports of increasing developer interest in investing in inner-ring suburbs with changing consumer preferences and other factors. I'm curious about what evidence of that you're seeing and what is getting in the way of more of that.
Yeah, we are seeing that. The last 4 months, we've probably, 4 to 6 months, we've probably talked to as many developers as we had in the previous 3 or 4 years. So we're seeing an increase in interest. Our challenges are that we're a fully developed community that was developed on fairly small parcels. So for somebody to do what's considered a small project, 2 or 3 acres, might involve acquiring 30 properties. And without eminent domain, that is almost impossible. And so the developers say, we'd love to do something there. The process just gives us nightmares, though. So while we'd rather be there than in Eden Prairie, it was nice talking to you, but now we're going to call Eden Prairie, and they'll tell us that they have 3 or 4 acres just sitting there for us.
I think this same those in Columbia Heights and as well as Oakdale, we see interest, but eminent domain, we don't have to assemble land. Tax increment financing, its ability was reduced by 25% in 2002 with property tax reform. We just redeveloped a mall site. We had to go back to the legislature twice to get a tax increment district extended twice, and we still had to put money in the deal. We have a philosophy, in my opinion, in this region where we still think it's 1960 and we're all about the growth at the periphery and the new shiny stuff. We do not have a strategic focus on reinvestment. We have a program here, a policy here, but no overall strategic focus on reinvestment. And because we don't have that, we don't have the tools. And I think inner ring suburbs are in for a rude awakening over the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and even though we're not inner ring per se, we've seen increased interest, but it's not in terms of the areas that need reinvestment, it's not happening in those areas. Our developer interest is being driven by the 610 corridor. We are trying to get folks interested in some of the redevelopment areas that we've had in place now for 6-7 years. We had a pretty controversial project prior to my arrival in 2007 that acquired a significant apartment complex, and that property, since we tore it down in 2008, has been sitting vacant with no developer interest whatsoever. 12 acres of what you would think is prime land, because its location, its inability to generate revenue. And even in the 610 corridor, we're finally getting some interest in multifamily development projects, and because of the experience of the last couple of decades, there isn't a lot of interest by the policymakers in doing affordability in those projects. And so if we want to have market rate multifamily projects in an area that's growing and is going to need that type of supportive housing for the businesses that are being built, we're going to have to subsidize it significantly because the development costs aren't being supported by the market rates.
There was a statement made earlier, I think it was.
Could you identify
Jamie.
yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
so I'm Mark Stevens. I think Jamie made the comment before about limited authority that local governments have in relationship to other groups like Met Council or the state with regard to addressing RCAPs, so racially concentrated areas of poverty. But I'm curious across all of the different cities, like what role do you feel local government can play in addressing those areas and reducing some of those disparities?
Well, I think it's challenging right now because the different communities start from a different interest base. And so I think that utilizing the information in the FHEA is the beginning of that conversation to bring communities together when you start talking about the economic success of the region and how the actions in certain communities affects the outcome in the entire region. And I think that's the basis for creating that collaboration and cooperation. Because for these other communities, it's out of sight, out of mind. And frankly, without any sort of influence from the legislature or any sort of authority for the Metropolitan Council beyond what they have for housing, which is not a system, it's going to be very hard to bring cities together on this issue.
I just wanted to add, I think you got to shine a light on it. I think there needs to be a better assessment of each census tract. I think it needs to be included in the comprehensive plan. So we need to start looking at neighborhoods and planning for what's there now and what we want in the future. And I think the first step is to shine a light on it, saying if you don't change the way you're doing things now, here's where you could be in the future. And I think that would get our city council's attention. I mean, we're starting to look at that right now anyway. But I think the other thing I would throw out there for the Met Councils, they have the LCA programs, the LHIA, the LCDA. Maybe what they want is like a jobs incentive account too. So bringing jobs into these areas instead of just housing. So maybe there's a way to take and increase that amount of money, another 8 million, and use that to attract living wage jobs into these areas instead of just the housing.
Well, I would say, there are 182 cities and townships in the 7-county metro area. To think that there's one scoring system for a grant application that would apply to 182 of those is just ludicrous. One of the things that we ought to be addressing in our comprehensive plans, there should be a section on socioeconomics where we have our own goals. We send that into the Metropolitan Council, and the Metropolitan Council says, yes, those look like good goals for your community. And then the scoring system ought to be not how are you attaining our goals as a Met Council, how are you attaining your goals as a community, and that's how you get your points.
Well, Sheila Sims, you all are kind of hitting around the edges of what I'm going to ask, but you all kind of giving the impression that you all in the cities are kind of helpless in this and things of that nature. And I'm asking, how are you holding others accountable, like the Met Council, HUD, the school districts, politicians, realtors, in regards to what you see and what happening or potentially going to happen down the road? Just because you all have some power at some level, but also turning around and strategizing and holding others accountable, others that that can influence or make something different happen in your communities.
Well, one of the ways is we are participating with this effort. The second thing is a lot of things that we can do are through subdivision and zoning regulation that ensures that affordable housing or mixed-use developments can be built, say, for example, in Oakdale, so dispersing the need. The other thing we can do is using financial inducements like tax increment financing to make redevelopment possible. However, I've worked in 3 cities in the metro area, and we're only 20 miles apart, but we're light years in terms of political will. And I think that's the biggest. You have to have a champion on the city council who really thinks this is important and wants to push it. And I don't necessarily think there's always those champions. And I think that's probably If the mayor says I want to go that way, it gets 90% easier. No matter what I think, or maybe even Jamie thinks, we can only sort of shine the light on things, make them see things a little differently, but unless they make it a priority, it's pretty hard to change the direction.
For me, I would say it's probably two things. One is education, trying to make sure that our policymakers are educated in the issues, and trying to make sure we're educated in the issues as well. And then giving people a forum. It's not Richfield's not my community, Brooklyn Park's not Jamie's community, it's the people that live there, and giving them the forum to have a voice. And I will tell you that Brooklyn Park has done probably a better job of that than any community I've ever seen. They really do bring their residents in and try to make sure that they have that voice.
Maybe we should move on to the parent groups if we can now. And if you can stick around, maybe people might want to ask some further questions. People wonder why schools should be involved in a housing plan. Well, the simple reason is the law requires it. The civil rights law requires that before affordable housing is placed in the community, you have to evaluate its effect on the public school systems and whether the housing plan will be segregative or integrated. There's also a statutory framework. Not only does the Fair Housing Act require the consultation with schools and trying to understand the effect of a housing policy on whether it will make schools integrated or segregated. The state Land Use Planning Act says that schools are a local government for purposes of the Land Use Planning Act. The Met Council is required to do an inventory of school buildings, and this relates to an initial finding by in a federal court that Minneapolis was a dual school system, and frequently these kinds of provisions to keep track of affordable housing, to keep track of school capital buildings in the context of civil rights is a requirement of the Equal Protection Clause, and it's also part of the Land Use Planning Act. Many consultation requirements in the Met Council's Land Use Planning Act that schools are able to comment on the local government plans, that local governments should be commenting on the school plans, that the Met Council should be commenting on the capital plans of the metropolitan area. The legislature's also authorized the Met Council and the Department of Education to work together on issues of desegregation. They've asked the Council and the Department of Education to try to work cooperatively together on that issue so that not all of the work of school desegregation has to be done by transfer policies and busing, that some of it can be done by the placement of affordable housing. In the last few decades, the Twin Cities has gone from a place in the country that had virtually no segregated schools to last year almost 150 racially segregated elementary schools, the fastest growth in the country. Almost all of the affordable housing for the last 20 years has been built either in the attendance boundaries of set of schools that are completely segregated or those in the first-ring suburbs that are undergoing segregation. Almost none has been built in predominantly white schools. If you look at the categories the Met Council talks about as important for housing, transit and close to existing job centers, not job growth, these strongly favor locations where the schools are segregated or resegregating. So many civil rights advocates wish that the schools had been more involved, and particularly in places like Saint Paul, where the city is going through a school district planning process that is resulting in a more segregated pattern of neighborhood enrollment. The NAACP will be talking about that at greater length. But also in the southwestern corridor, where St. Louis Park has drawn racially integrated boundaries, Hopkins has drawn racially integrated boundaries, Eden Prairie has drawn racially integrated boundaries, and none of these forces that have been trying to keep those schools integrated have been in the conversation at all, or been allowed to participate in that conversation at all. Not only in violation of federal law, but also in a violation of common sense in many ways. So we have some people here from school districts, and they're going to talk a little bit about their comments on the fair housing equity assessments, and then we can move on to the next group. So go ahead, Seth.
Thank you. My name is Mary Ciccone. I'm with Parents United for Public Schools. We are a statewide organization that has advocates in all 134 legislative districts. Our focus is on state and federal level policy and its impact on our students and the schools that serve them. Primarily, we work not to speak for parents, but to help them speak for themselves. We attempt to translate the complexity of school policy and help parents navigate specifically the legislative arena so that they're able to use their voices where they're most important. We have a great concern with the growing school segregation, specifically in our metro area. We have areas like Worthington and Northfield that have had large influxes of new citizens, and they've been able to integrate their schools successfully, and their schools are doing much better than the schools in our urban area. And the largest growing population of K-12 is with our children of color. And we have a tremendous desire for our metropolitan schools to integrate at a balanced rate, similar to what happened in Northfield. We see this as specifically due to the housing that is happening. And this Fair Housing Equity Assessment drafted by LISC, we understand its need to place transit as a defining indicator for housing decisions, but it seems to be done absolutely without schools as any kind of significant part of the assessment. And when that happens, school boards then are left to make decisions to try to integrate their schools. And they're left with truly few viable alternatives. You can have magnet schools, or everyone's favorite, busing, or you can attempt to change boundaries like several of our school districts have, and then the ire of certain people and saying, well, then we're leaving, and Minnesota has open enrollment, so you can go to school wherever, and yet our funding streams to our schools don't advantage the school district that makes the appropriate decision to integrate their schools. They allow the money to leave with the white flight. So it leaves school boards in ridiculous positions to be able to actually do anything for integration. Specifically, Maple Grove and Osseo, it's one school district, yet because of the housing that has been going into one region of that school district, there have been attempts from the other side to literally pull the district away and create two districts. This is antithetical to everything that we believe in. Hopkins has tried valiantly to make wonderful decisions, and then they have people come and say, well, we're leaving, and out the door goes a couple hundred people with all the funding that goes with it, stopping Hopkins' ability to truly do what they want to do. The Fair Housing Equity Assessment drafted by LISC specifically speaks about placing or refurbishing 4,500 housing units in Frogtown. And when I contacted, actually it was interesting, the director of the Frogtown Neighborhood Association, who's very connected to Frogtown, and I said, where are you on that? She said, that's impossible. Where did that number come from? So here's someone on the ground who actually is working with people who was totally unaware of that. We see that we believe parents want our schools integrated. We believe that we understand that our kids are living in a global world and need to understand how to deal and be and work with all cultures. And with the segregation that's going on, we're disadvantaging not just children of color, but children of white families. And that is absolutely not what we want. We want integrated schools. We also see metro areas around the country that have not taken advantage of these opportunities, and we don't want Minnesota and Minneapolis, Saint Paul to be like that. So we specifically ask that this assessment be rejected until schools are brought to the table as a significant voice as part of the assessment, and rework it.
you have a statement too?
I do. My name's Shauna Headland, and I also work with Parents United for Public Schools. But what I'd really like to speak to is being a parent in Minneapolis and my concerns as a parent. I have 3 kids, 2 that attend a magnet school in Minneapolis. And I'm just going to start personally and anecdotally and say that my parents specifically moved my family from Baltimore to Minnesota in the 80s. They had roots in the Midwest, and they wanted to come back to an integrated community, which they felt it was in the 80s. And I think that's an interesting contrast to our experience as parents of young children. I have a 3rd grader and a kindergartner. And I would say, though we have a successfully integrated school, because it's a magnet school, I can't say the same of our neighborhoods. And I think it's interesting to hear the voice of children there. I think it took 6 days for my first kindergartner, to come home and say, "Mom, my classroom looks different than my neighborhood." And when my newest kindergartner went to school, it took him 24 hours, and he said, "Mom, where do those other people live?" So what concerns me is illustrated in that story, and that's the onus of integration, which we know in terms of research supports the best education for all. The onus of that is apparent to kindergartners to be on schools and not on city, local, state government, the Met Council, or HUD. And when that becomes apparent to kindergartners, we need to take that to heart as their leaders. And obviously my biggest concern there too is that if, for instance, I live on my neighborhood, my street is 2 blocks long, and on those 2 blocks there are 24 kids under the age of 15. Lots of kids. Most of them attend Minneapolis Public Schools. In the morning, 7 different buses come to that 2-block area to take the kids to school. Imagine the expense. And one of the primary reasons that they do that is that the promise of choice and the promise of integration, equity, and fairness in a very large district. So clearly, the school district has the burden of the cost of integrating where neighborhoods are failing, or the powers that be in terms of housing are failing to integrate. I want that money in my schools to go to teaching kids, not to swim in upstream to change what we do in terms of integrating our neighborhoods.
Other questions?
I have a question. Julie Learson, Neighborhood Hub. I was following this. My question comes specifically about Minneapolis. I'm a Minneapolis kid and a active Minneapolis public school, and I was so appalled at the decision making that went on this last year with the school board around a particular high school that is bursting at the seams, and then you have other high schools in other neighborhoods that are struggling to fill seats. And when you talk about that price per student, maybe it's $16,000, I don't know what it is up to today, then you maybe have 400 students at North High, 1,600 students at Southwest, and then the decision makers go ahead and decide to pump $40 million into an expansion at Southwest High School. Where's the accountability from the Department of Education on, in terms of that decision making, and also as it relates to this housing? I mean, I don't know if you can answer that about the housing.
Actually, there is, I'm not sure what the Minnesota Department of Education is supposed to be working with housing, but the Minnesota Department of Education does not have to weigh into that specific piece. And what you've pointed out is exactly the problem. That you, instead of having this overview for the entire Met area, we are putting the whole idea of integrated schools into the hands of a few people who are elected every couple of years, who change direction every couple of years. That's an issue. It's a terrible issue. And years ago, when they thought, oh, all we need to do is build really nice facilities in North, and then everybody will come. Well, because the housing pattern had nothing to do with that, look what happened. So that's exactly what I mean. School boards are left with precious few alternatives. And that's, it's
Well, and in
ludicrous.
this case, I would say a complete lack of political will and courage.
I would agree, but again,
Because
that's...
you have an inequitable, our kids are failing because they're in an inequitable system. This is Carla Bates was the one school board member who
Right.
said, no,
Right.
we have to, if we redraw these lines, we can fill up all these high schools, but guess what? We're gonna get crucified by those parents in Southwest.
But imagine if, and you know, we've talked about this often, you know, imagine if there was help from HUD or the assessment to be able to backbone some of these locally elected officials to say, if we do this, then that, and we get this, or this is something. That would be tremendously helpful.
Other questions? I noticed that, LaShella, go ahead.
LaShella Sims, when you all were describing your neighborhoods and school systems, it sounded more like desegregation versus integration. It sounds like you wanted to be integration. And I'll ask you and any of the others that were up here to testify, do you all see how you all interrelated? And the thread is housing? And so you're kind of like working in silos, and when you do that, I think you disperse your strengths versus strategizing with each other and how to come with that common thread to make better, healthier communities.
And if I may, that's exactly when Myron brought this to our attention, that schools are not at the table.
Right.
And when we looked into our schools to find out why they weren't at the table, and it's a nexus between they've not been asked and the other side, bluntly, it's political. Why should I get involved if? So we're here saying force them together because that is essential. The housing and schools and education, and the big deal Met Council's working on now is economic vitality. How can you do that without putting all those together? That's our whole point. So this assessment, it fails. It fails to take into account how we can move to integration.
And I can understand what you're saying once I started reading a lot of Myron's stuff and watching him through the years, and he got away a long time ago, but when he had started presenting it to the school boards and community, sometimes I ask him, you know, you're about the person in modern days that I know that people want to tar and feather and get him out of there quickly.
Agreed.
I noticed we've had a couple. Jonathan Palmer showed up, and he was a witness that wanted to testify before, and LaShella, you wanted to testify too, is that right?
I can't.
Okay. So maybe we can let Jonathan come up, and LaShella, why don't you both talk for a minute, and then we're still waiting on the NAACPs, so. So Jonathan, you want to start and state your name for the record and say where you're from?
Certainly. I'm Jonathan Palmer. I am from North Minneapolis. I'm a resident of North Minneapolis. I'm also board member for the Cleveland Board, which is in North Minneapolis. Member of the 4th Precinct Care Task Force. And then over the past 17 years, I've been board chair or ED of a number of organizations, neighborhood organizations, Jordan Area Community Council, Stevens Square Community Organization, Victory Neighborhood Association. So related with neighborhoods in North Minneapolis. I'm coming to talk a little bit about the idea of the cycle that comes around what's a method of reverse gentrification. And we have communities within the city that we do not pay enough attention to and do not try to balance out what is happening when we're doing plans around affordable housing, around amenities within communities. One of the cycles that continually happens in impacted communities is we pile in concentrations of affordable housing into those communities under the guise that there are people there that need the affordable housing, and we do not focus in on home ownership within those communities, putting the resources in to help people within those communities have home ownership, transfer to home ownership, or support home ownership, and instead concentrate affordable housing. And we concentrate it to the level that the property values decrease, the amenities do not come in within those communities, and the values in those communities drop. And they drop to a level that once they reach rock bottom, that's when gentrification starts. People come in, developers and investors come in, they don't have a care or concern for the neighborhood. They're not looking at what the residents need. They're looking at what kind of a profit can be made out of buying this area out, going ahead and doing physical improvements or bringing in resources for a different population. And as they do that, what it does is it prices the people that live there out of that community. And it forces them to move to another community that has affordable housing, because all they can afford is the affordable housing. So you begin this cycle of moving to impacted neighborhoods, gentrifying them, pricing people out of their homes, and improving for new residents to come in, and it generally tends to be white residents versus people of color. And you're not doing the reciprocal of moving the affordable housing out into the communities that already have the amenities, and the communities that also can sustain it and provide a path to home ownership, provide a path to amenities for people within those communities. In North Minneapolis, a specific example, we had at the corner of Penn and Lowry. I was executive director of the Jordan Area Community Council when they came looking to do development at that point. They wanted to put in what is there now an Aldi's, Subway, and as they were talking about that, I suggested, why don't you look at doing a Trader Joe's? It's owned by the same company. It has different kinds of foods, but there's a community that appeals to that more and which people connect into that. And there were already Cub in a number of grocery stores. They said flat out that they wouldn't do that. They said that the community would not support that. They would not put in a coffee place, a Starbucks, a Caribou, anything like that, because those are not what the community wanted and the community would support. It's the thinking around that that goes ahead and decides what a community wants and needs without talking to the community, as I was the representative from the community suggesting what they should do. And it is the things that go along with affluent communities that are not being put into impacted neighborhoods until the price values drops to a level where people can purchase those and move the communities out. In 2005, I believe it was, we had a memo that came out from the director of the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development for the city of Minneapolis, Lee Sheehy at that time, and the chief of police at that time, Bill McManus, who said that there's an integral relationship between development and public safety. As you increase development within a community, you increase public safety. And the whole idea behind that was for doing development along West Broadway and the need for there to be development happening within the community. And it's one of the things that can help make a community safer. When you look at those factors, people within government, people within public service areas have a moral imperative to go ahead and move towards that and not bring amenities, not bring resources only when a certain level of income has arrived in the community or when a certain demographic has arrived in the community. If we're going to look at communities and support parity across communities, we have to bring those resources all across the communities.
Shella?
Greetings, I'm LaShella Sims. I live on the north side, and I'm also an organizer with MICA, and my responsibilities at this time with MICA is to cover the various transit systems that are coming into our area, whether it's light rail or BRT, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't think people are getting, at this point, or making the connections of how important housing is in regards to these things, and housing choices, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, I don't see them at the decision-making tables where these things are being decided as per usual historically. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think the system, however it is, even right now to me in this arena, is we're kind of pitted against each other in various entities and where we're doing or not doing or feel helpless. And while we're doing this and have these conversations, which need to be, the power people, they're outside going on and making decisions and things like that. So we never seem to make the connections and see our power in doing that. At this point, in terms of the housing pattern, I, as a parent, for example, the choice I would make or need to make is to live in an area where there is affordable housing, but the neighborhood isn't healthy in terms of good schools, good jobs, etc., versus moving in outward to where I think my children will get a better education though in those schools, but then I'm kind of segregated in terms of family and friends, or maybe I don't even have a car or to get back and forth. So I ask myself, why don't I have the choice to live where I want to in healthy communities? Why isn't the system setting up or encouraging my choice to live wherever I want with healthy communities wherever I am? Versus I have to make a choice between where I live and education. And that's a clash, and that's an ever-going cycle in that regards. And the young man here, I forget his name, but Palmer, his last name, mentioned housing. I mean, home ownership. And at this time, Mike is part of that, but Build Wealth and other communities of color and organizations are trying to push through at the legislature a $50 million bill in regards to rental and facilitating home ownership programs that have worked. And it's been an uphill struggle in terms of pushing that rock. But here again, I don't see you all there or organizations like that in terms of supporting or help push that rock out with the entities, the power people and things. With our various struggles, we have gotten the bill through the House of Representatives and like from unanimous vote. But here again, that takes a struggle and pushing. And now we're trying to get it through the Senate so that it can become law. And then money would be allocated and things like that. But here again, I think the common thread, as I listen to people talk, is working in silos. Don't seem to realize your strength and the strategies, number one, in holding people accountable. And I think because we haven't known about or how to, or the entities that do know haven't had the power people accountable for what we're in now in regards to the patterns we're in now. The people having to move and try to get schools, unhealthy communities, the school systems and things like that, and making that connection between housing and schools. And so some of the places that I think through the years that entities that haven't been held accountable and have the power and structures to make a difference are the Met Council and HUD. And they turn over people over and over and over. So because there hasn't been anybody saying, hey, and knowing what their laws are and what they can do and whatever, so those entities just go on historically, per usual. And it's going to take, well, this could be a beginning, but there are a lot of advocates out there in the community organizations saying, no, we need a change. We want to become healthy. We want this and things like that. So that's basically.
Thank you. Are there questions that people would like to ask? Okay, well, we've got Jim Hilbert from St. Paul, and both a parent and a member of the NAACP at St. Paul. I don't think, is Jeff Martin here yet?
He's on his way, stuck in court.
Okay, he's stuck in court, and so maybe you can start, Jim.
Sure.
Thank you. Do you need any technical assistance?
I need to navigate past this.
Yeah, right.
It'll be all right.
Okay. Maybe you should state your name and tell your background.
Sure. Before I do that, I did bring some. I brought a written statement as well with some exhibits. What's the?
I'll take the written statement and you can use it. We'll include it in our comments with the others.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Hilbert. As Myron indicated, I'm a parent. I live in St. Paul. I'm also the executive director of the Center for Negotiation and Justice. I'm on the executive board of the Saint Paul NAACP. Years ago, I was a plaintiff civil rights attorney, and I was one of the plaintiff attorneys in a desegregation lawsuit here in Minneapolis that was brought by the Minneapolis NAACP and a number of parents. And I was counting the years. It's been almost 20 years. Nearly 20 years when that case was first filed. I'm here today to talk about the impact of housing policy on what's happening specifically in the St. Paul school system. And I love the previous comment talking about the connection between housing and schools. There's obviously a very tight correlation between what happens in housing and what happens in the school system. For the most part, children go to school often according to where they live. And what's happening in St. Paul is particularly interesting with respect to housing policy, because as many of you know, St. Paul has implemented a new community schools plan that in many ways makes the residents even more of a predicting value in terms of where children go to school. So a little background on the St. Paul Public Schools. I think most people are familiar. It's 38,000 students roughly, about 3/4 students of color, about 3/4 students free or reduced price lunch. And St. Paul had historically what you might call a modest desegregation plan, small d. There were some efforts to try to desegregate the schools. They were very small and had, I think, overall a fairly small impact. In fact, if you look at the current demographics of the schools in St. Paul, we have 16 schools, more than 90% low income and students of color. There are 5 schools actually, despite the demographics of the district overall. 5 schools have less than 40% low income students and at least 60% white students. So the community schools plan is called Strong Schools, Strong Communities. And it started in part in 2011 and really got started full-time this last fall. And I want to highlight one feature of the plan that is particularly relevant. They divided the district into 6 areas. We call them areas, and the areas basically determine where you go to school. And so, moving away from the small desegregation plan that it had before, it moved to this explicitly community schools plan. What's interesting though about the plan is the district had a few reasons for doing it. And I've attached some of these materials. One main reason was they want children to go to school closer to home. And they without a great deal of citation, they say students learn better when they're closer to home, so they want them to go closer to home. They also were going to save somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $9 million in transportation costs. And if you think back a couple of years to what the district budgets were like, this was an enormously important savings. But what's important to recall, what's important to remember here is they very clearly said this is not a plan that is intended to exacerbate existing racial and socioeconomic segregation. In fact, in response to community concerns about a community schools plan in an already segregated school district, the district said, actually, we want to continue to build diversity in the schools. We want to continue to try to improve the situation in the schools with respect to the demographics of the school buildings, and even went so far as to say in a letter that was sent from the district to the NAACP, they said that based on our analysis and our intent, in most instances, the level of diversity at the individual sites will increase. And why this is important is because they made a number of important assumptions about the housing patterns in St. Paul when they implemented their community schools plan. They brought in a gentleman named Dennis Cheeseborough from Teamworks International to do a study of housing patterns in St. Paul. And at a public presentation, Mr. Cheeseborough and other members of district leadership presented their assumptions that basically St. Paul would become more integrated in terms of its housing over the next few years. That, in fact, they even went so far, well, they only did it once, but they went so far in one public presentation to call St. Paul a naturally integrated city. Now, they only did that one time because that didn't stand up very long. But the point is, regardless of whether you accept their analysis that St. Paul was going to become more racially diverse and socioeconomically diverse over time in the housing patterns, that was the underlying presumption that in part led to the community schools plan. And they rely on that assumption when they say that the schools are not going to become any more segregated. In fact, we think they're going to become less segregated. They even attached to it a spreadsheet that had a list of schools that said over the next few years, while they're not going to become all integrated overnight, we are going to see less racial segregation in the majority of schools. Now, I'll just highlight one that is a little bit amusing. And when they sent the letter, this school was still known as Webster. Remember, Webster Elementary in St. Paul has now been renamed. It's now Obama, and they had projected that by next fall, this letter is from 2011, so by next fall, the fall of 2014, that Webster, now Obama, would be 44% white, which is a pretty astonishing change considering right now it's 98% kids of color. So regardless of what you think about their analysis, regardless of the accuracy of these predictions, the key point here is that they have based a community schools plan on assumptions on what is going to happen in terms of the housing patterns in St. Paul. And this is relevant because as we think about what is going to happen and what local housing authorities and statewide or metropolitan housing authorities, even federal housing authorities, can do with respect to St. Paul, it is important to realize that the district explicitly relied on increasing integration of housing in St. Paul. I think one other piece of this that's relevant is one area of St. Paul that is particularly sensitive to any increased housing segregation is the area along the Central Corridor. And I think of it in terms of schools. You know, we can all visualize the Central Corridor in our mind, and to the right on the eastern side is much more poverty, much heavier concentration of people of color. On the left-hand side, the western side, at least up to the St. Paul border, is concentration of white residents, low poverty generally. And so if you think about that eastern side, that is generally served by two elementary schools, Jackson and Maxfield. And the reason this is important is because those schools are already heavily children of color and students receiving free or reduced price lunch. In fact, Maxfield is, if I can read it here, Maxfield is 96% students of color and 98% low income. Jackson Elementary is currently 95% students of color, 92% low income. That region, were it to receive additional low-income housing, is creating even greater concentrations of students of color and low-income students for those two schools. And anecdotally, I have asked district officials from the early get-go whether their housing analysis took into account what was going to happen with the central corridor, what was being considered in terms of additional affordable housing in that area, and they have not. That was not part of their original analysis. And it goes back to what they presumed from the start, that the city is going to be more integrated housing-wise, that is how they essentially plan to desegregate the St. Paul schools. Again, setting aside what you might think of that judgment, that is their impulse. So my point today is simply to highlight that we now have a community schools plan in St. Paul. That the community schools plan in St. Paul was based on a presumption, right or wrong, was based on a presumption that the housing patterns in St. Paul would become less segregated. That presumption is in part going to become true or not based on what local and metropolitan-wide housing authorities do with respect to housing policy in St. Paul. The only real mechanism that St. Paul has to reduce segregation is relying now on housing patterns. So my call to the housing authorities is simply to pay careful attention to the impact of various housing policies and initiatives, including enforcement of discrimination laws, including the placement of affordable housing, including looking at what we can do to improve integrated housing everywhere, to look carefully at the impact of those policies and initiatives on the St. Paul schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions? Anybody have questions? No, one of the things...
We have a question here.
Okay, go ahead.
You actually did crossed a couple things. Okay, we have predatory lending, redlining and stuff. What have the NAACP have done to address these problems that we have?
It's a great question. I have good news and bad news. Here's the bad news. I'm going to dodge your question. But the good news outweighs the bad news. The good news is the president of the Saint Paul NAACP is right after me. You can ask him directly. I will say, sir, that my information on predatory lending and efforts in the NAACP is very limited. So I don't know.
Well, you know, that's part of the bigger problem that we have with all this stuff happening in the neighborhoods. I'm talking about some of you and
yeah,
and down that way. So that was a big problem.
Can I add one, before you go to your next question, can I just add one point? Because I do think this is important. I think predatory lending, what we saw recently from the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity about discrimination in mortgage lending, I think issues of racial steering, I think all of these various issues clearly contribute to the patterns of housing in St. Paul. And it's certainly up to community organizations, to individuals, to other private enterprises to do what they can. I however, think that we have local housing authorities who have the charge and the resources to address those things directly, who need to step up and do that. And I think it's even more important where we're talking about school districts, and my focus, unfortunately, is just on school districts, so that's the lens I'm looking through. But when we have a school district that's relying on housing patterns, the obligation to enforce those laws, to take seriously testing for steering and other things we know can alleviate some of these issues, frankly, I look first to the government authorities that are authorized and obligated to take care of those things. I'm not saying anybody else shouldn't. I'm just saying that starts with them.
Okay, so some of these gentrification, either natural occurring or artificial, have been exacerbated by the withholding of LGA. Some of that has to do directly with our current governor and the past governor. So what is being done to address some of these? I ain't seen nobody get taken to court. There's all these banks that are still doing this, and they're not being held accountable. So what are the residents and the communities affected? What can they do?
I'm tempted to give you a very long answer, but my testimony today is limited to the St. Paul schools and the impact of the housing policies on the St. Paul schools. I think what you just raised is a very interesting question, and I'm hoping that that's been a subject of previous or perhaps subsequent testimony.
Yeah, I think the president of the NAACP is going to address this, hopefully, when he arrives, and we haven't seen him, so we might take a hiatus. One of the issues we do have, very bad mortgage lending discrimination in the Twin Cities. The disparities between white and black homeowners is the worst in the country, and here he is, on a perfect cue, like a Hollywood movie.
Nobody's happier to see him than I am. Not that I didn't like your question, sir. I think you have very good questions.
Yeah, but go ahead. You have a question.
I do have a question. Can you speak to, we've been talking about, and I appreciate this idea of operating in silos and making decisions in silos. Can you speak to where you, from your point of view, is the most promising intersection of schools and housing authorities? Are we talking superintendents talking to Met Council? Or are we talking about the school board speaking directly to city and local governments? What's the most promising intersection?
You know, I wish I had a good example for you. It was really frustrating to watch sort of two rather prominent initiatives happening in St. Paul simultaneously, completely in the dark of one another. I mean, it was two ships passing the night, and I think that's part of the problem of how we fragment some of our policy. Thinking back, and I saw Tim Thompson in the audience, so he may enjoy this reference, but in the original Minneapolis NAACP lawsuit, which is about school segregation, we actually sued the Met Council. Because part of the lawsuit was the Met Council is not doing what it needs to do in terms of housing policy, and that is contributing to school segregation. And so I think it's hard to disentwine these policies. And I wish I saw a better interaction between school leaders and housing leaders. I'm sure there are better examples. My focus has been on St. Paul, and it's almost impossible to conceive how these two enterprises didn't see the need to interact as these two big initiatives were happening.
There is also there's requirements of consultation between both two. The FHEA and all of its documents and all of its guiding documents says that the schools have to be at the table, and there has to be consultation not only with schools but also civil rights authority. That is a federal law. Just as one observer, I asked dozens of times throughout the process for the schools to be involved, and they were never invited to the table, never were able to participate, nor were the civil rights organizations. And I think that there was a very strong, clear requirement in the federal law that should occur. Also, the state statute requires the consultation between the Met Council and the Department of Education on these issues. Also, the Metropolitan Land Use Planning Act and the pre-existing civil rights laws, the 1968 Civil Rights Law, as articulated by the Shannon versus HUD decision and by the citing regulations of all forms of affordable housing, including the low-income housing tax credit. So there's a clear obligation that they consulted. There was a clear obligation that the schools should be involved by Minnesota statute, by federal statute, by the FHEA process, and they were not at the table, except today. So, Mr. Martin, why don't you testify and state your name for the record and tell where you're from?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to give testimony. My name is Jeffrey Martin. I'm the current president of St. Paul branch of the NAACP and the first vice president of the Minnesota-Dakota State Conference. My testimony today will actually segue perfectly off of what your last statement was about the invitation to the process. The St. Paul NAACP has not been a part of the process up to this point, nor has the Minneapolis branch of the NAACP, nor has the state and Dakota conference has been invited to be a part of this process. Our only part of the process that we've paid up to this part is forcing ourselves in the manner of a lawsuit. When it was decided that there would be no stops down University Avenue except for starting at Lexington and ending at the Capitol, we joined and partnered with business people in the area and also concerned citizens in the area to make sure that they had a voice in that process and to say that we not only deserve those 3 spots, but how dare you not even come to us before you decide where the put stops. So I think the process as it is right now is broken. I think that the powers to be at the Met Council and at the various housing authorities don't necessarily consider the communities that they're impacting, at least not in a positive way. I think they are considering them, but in a negative way. I wish this was a simple solution to a simple problem. However, what we're finding out is that there's a lot of interconnectedness between different entities, that with the end result being that we're going to remain a very segregated Twin Cities if we don't do something about it. You have redlining on the banks, and you have mortgage, not mortgage sellers, but mortgage lenders who seem to target our communities for higher risk loans, and automatically assume that we're bad credit risk when we walk in through the door, and to sell us products that aren't good for us or them as far as in purchasing a home, and not offering us access to products that we would qualify for due to our credit rating and our credit history and income status. You have real estate brokers who choose to show houses in areas only that they feel that we should live in as communities of color. And the bigger issue is that you have a small group of developers and people who are supposedly the experts in building low-income housing, basically controlling where that housing is going to be built. I don't know how much power they have or how they obtain their power, but the proof is in the pudding. If you're only building in certain areas when you have other areas that are required by statute that you at least consider, but you continue to build in only one particular area to oversaturate that area with low-income housing based on the idea that it's near public transportation, when, as we know, public transportation reaches all areas. And as we know, people of lower means have transportation as well. We own cars, we own, we have the ability to come and go, and the jobs are located out in these first tier suburbs. So I think by controlling where a person has the ability to live and controlling the area where you put low-income housing for those who need that extra assistance to restart their lives or to begin their lives as an independent person, then I think what you're doing is you're really controlling everything. And as Jim has outlined, you're controlling the quality of education they're going to receive. You're going to limit those options. You're going to control where they go to school, what schools they attend, which will greatly affect their ability to go to college, which will greatly affect their ability to have a higher earning wage job, which will affect their ability to purchase homes. We're not against low-income housing. Of course, we are in favor of low-income housing, but we're more in favor of home ownership and establishing community roots and having access to avenues that other communities seem to have access to, where you can get some stability in your community, where you can receive a tax benefit from owning a home as opposed to the developer receiving a tax benefit for building a home in that area. So the NAACP would cry foul to the process as it is currently stated, and we agree with what we have read and what we have heard, that they are in violation of the federal FEHA laws as they currently stand. And we would like for them to change the current policies that they have in place, change the way they interact with communities of color, change the way they they don't reach out to civil rights organizations, but I'd like them to at least consider doing what the law requires them to do. And with that, I'd open up for questions.
So, this process, both Mr. Hilbert, you were working on the school integration process, and Mr. Martin, you're the president of the NAACP. We're embarking on a very large housing plan in St. Paul, at least 4,000 units that are going to be built in the city. Why weren't you involved? Why didn't you come to the meetings? Why didn't you participate in this process?
Well, I don't know which avenues of outreach they have performed up to this point. I can just tell you that they're not effective. Of course, Jim and I aren't the only members of the NAACP, so it's not an imperative that we're there at the meetings, but that someone from our organization is there at the meetings. And we do have some members who are serving in different roles in the community, which I'm sure that they were present at some of those meetings. However, that information wasn't shared back with us in that form. And, so I think if you have a straight directive to involve civil rights organizations, you should reach out directly to that civil rights organization and have them be involved, instead of assuming if you see a person of color in the room that you've got that box checked.
Well, just looking at the requirements of this planning process, the Fair Housing Planning Guide requires the preparer of the FHEA, the Met Council, to establish relationships with quote-unquote diverse groups. Among the groups that must be considered are advocacy groups and organizations that have among their concerns the needs, including the housing needs, of particular segments of the population, such as people of specific racial or ethnic groups, in parentheses, Black, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asian Americans, or Alaska Natives. So is the NAACP such a group?
Oh, we are, and we do have a relationship with them. It just happens to be a hostile one.
I see. And are there other groups that you're aware of that have this special role under federal law that should have been consulted in this process? Are there other civil rights groups in St. Paul that are known and well-known advocacy groups and organizations that have among their concerns advocacy for specific racial or ethnic groups?
Yes, there are some that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are more that I'm not aware of that should have been invited.
And are you aware that were they involved in this process at all?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge. And what kinds of things do you think, if you were to be involved in this process, if you had been involved in this process, what kinds of concerns do you think you would have brought to the table in terms of a housing plan with 4,000 units of affordable housing?
Well, I think the key part is giving a voice to the process. I mean, making sure, our role as advocacy organizations is making sure that those people that are affected are at the table, that they're just not given the results of the meeting and hand it to them and say, this is what we decided about you and your state, but to actually give you a seat at that table and say, okay, this is your community. How can we make this community better? What plan would you have? I mean, we have some great CDC organizations that are in the community that they need some support. They need to be empowered to make those decisions on behalf of the community, not consulted after the fact or not consulted too late in the process to really have a say in which direction it's going. We have, these community development organizations, not the one in particular, and I want to call out Aurora St. Anthony. This is not who I'm talking about. Right. But other CDCs their directors are making a ridiculous amount of money, and they have no connection to the community. None of their staff are from the community. There seem to have any community ties directly. And it just seems like if you got builders who don't live in the city, you've got CDCs who are run by people who have no connections to the city, board members of folks who are making a profit out of things that are going on. I don't think you have the environment for fairness to occur. I think you need to have a system set up to where the community can not only benefit, but employ people in the development of these units in the area, to bring some jobs to the area and have, if something is built in St. Paul, especially along the light rail area, the corridor, the central corridor, 90% of that, the funding should go to Aurora St. Anthony and through their CDC. There shouldn't be any other areas that it should go to. At least have them at the table and let's see how we're going to do this area. You're the player in this area. This is going to greatly affect your community. How can we make sure that you have a play in this, and that it's going to make you as an organization stronger? So, and I just don't think that that's happening in behind the scenes. I think that too often we send those agencies in on a David Goliath type situation, and the deck is kind of stacked against them. So that's why the NAACP wants to be involved, to support them, to make sure that their voice is heard even louder than what it already is.
And had you been invited to participate in the process surrounding the Fair Housing Equity Assessment, would you have wanted to do that?
Oh yes, I would have wanted, or definitely have designated someone who wanted even more than me to be involved with it, but we definitely would have had a voice at the table.
Do you have any reason to understand why you weren't involved or weren't invited to participate?
I think initially it might have been the litigation that we had going initially. I think that might have put them at odds, but it seemed to me as a practicing attorney, if you got some litigation going on, you definitely want to involve the persons that you're offending to make sure you don't have continual litigation going on and costing the state and government several hundred thousands of dollars.
Is it your belief that because you weren't involved at all in the shaping of the Fair Housing Equity Assessment and that that you were required in the Fair Housing Planning Guide to be involved, is that enough in and of itself to make the Fair Housing Equity Assessment
Invalid? Yes, I think it is.
All right, are there questions from anybody in the audience?
All right. Mr. Martin, my name is Von Larry. I am from Aurora, St. Anthony, so I do have an interest in this part. Now, I actually asked the gentleman next to you about when you guys found out about the gentrification and what the organization was doing about it with what happened to our community down there. So, are you guys still planning on doing something down there? Because we're still devastated.
Oh, yes. Now, you have to realize that the NAACP is a national organization. Units on and in themselves can initiate litigation. It has to go through a process, and it has to go through national channels because actually we were putting national in the bind. The litigation that was initiated in federal court that just recently came up with, that was not following protocol, but that did involve us in the discussion, which was good. But however, since then, we've learned from that, and we have to follow protocol to do that. But I will tell you that National is aware of what is going on, and the economic development chair is personally watching what happens here today and following up on that to make sure that we get the assistance that we need as a local unit to be able to advocate stronger for those in our area.
Well, the bad part of the gentrification started in 2008. That's when we lost like 30%.
The housing crisis, yeah.
So it's 2014. We haven't heard of anything coming from our so-called organizations that are doing anything about what's going on. Have you talked to the Senate? Have you talked to the legislators? Have you talked to the governor? We want to know what's going on.
Well, no, I didn't become president until 2011, so I can't tell you who talked to who in 2008.
Right. But is there any kind of way we can find out, because it's still happening?
If you're a member of the organization, you're free to come to our meetings and ask those questions.
Are there any other questions? Well, everybody's been very patient. We are going to finish a little bit ahead of time, which is pretty good for the law school. And anybody, hopefully people will stick around, and if they'd like to talk to me or other people, I'm sure there'll be people willing to do that. So unless there are any other questions.
I had one.
Okay, go ahead. Michelle.
In regard to some things, questions that were being asked of you, in regard, it sounds like if you were at the table or just has been an organization, you're very powerful in regards to your voice being at the table and bringing forth the voices from the community. And I kind of look at a balanced approach in regards to everything has at least two sides. Even though you weren't invited and things like that at the table, it would seem like, or why wasn't the NAACP, since you're here, not only Saint Paul but Minneapolis, because you know of the importance of certain things for the community, why would you wait to be asked? Seems like you would be there on top and have watchdogs out doing things. That's being proactive versus waiting for someone to invite you, knowing that powers that be don't necessarily want other powers that be to be there. And now that
I want you to misunderstand. We did have members there. They were serving in other roles. Some of them actually worked for Aurora St. Anthony. And they were there handling, wearing a different hat at that time, and we were getting information on what was going on in that area. We chose to follow through with the litigation first to see what came as a result of that. And now that that has died off, and those quote-unquote conditions set by Judge Frank have been met to his specifications, and that has ended, so now it's time to change strategy.
And I don't take anything away from that. That's an important aspect. But while that was happening, was there any other people that you had out side, keeping the track what was going on in regards to knowing that this time would come, that you all, that the litigation would end at some point, and you, so that the entities or faces that were there could go over here and find out what they're doing and help them keep the other powers that be accountable?
Sure. We had people in place, like I just told you before. We had people who were there, who was in charge, a chair of our economic development, which falls under this housing area as well. Chair was the person who attended those meetings and reported back in written form on what was happening at the meetings. So, and we're a volunteer organization. We rely on those foot soldiers that go out there to take out of their personal time to go to these meetings. No one gets paid from a staff member to go to these meetings and spend time with the meetings when they're not even on the agenda or acknowledged in any way, shape, or form. So those people I give real kudos to, that they took out of their personal lives to their own detriment on issues that not necessarily affect them, to go there and spend their time and report back to us on a monthly basis.
Can I also add that I think it would be a mistake to lay this at the feet of the NAACP. The NAACP covers a wide variety of issues, and they are not the only one that was not brought to the table. And that's actually the failure of the people who were organizing that, to not bring the NAACP to the table, which is, as Jeffrey has said, a national organization. I run Hallie Q. Brown Community Center. We're an 85-year-old organization that focuses on the African-American community in St. Paul. We come out of the settlement house movement. Nobody gave us a call either. The failure has been within the system to bring people who are stakeholders, people who have access to the table to talk about these issues. I don't think we need to focus in on the NAACP or other ones, because there's a wide agenda of issues that are being covered every day by these organizations. What we need to focus in on is what is happening within the systems that are not bringing the correct people to the table, that are not making sure that policy is being directed in such a way so that the people most affected are the ones that are having a voice and being represented.
And I can respect that, what you're saying, and I believe it, and I've seen that. But also at the same time, like I said before, there's has to be a balance someplace in regards to who's looking out for who and their interests and things like that. And as I've said before, there's going to be a certain aspect of the powers that be that don't want you all there for various reasons. So I can see them intentionally not reaching out to you all.
You're saying we should expect them to leave us out, and we have to be proactive about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Marlis Harris has a
Yeah, hi, I'm Marlis Harris, I'm with MinPost. I sense kind of a little bit of tension between two things that you two said. Mr. Hilbert, you were talking about how there's going to be more affordable housing put in a neighborhood that's already very segregated in a city that's shifting to community schools. So that would tend to make the schools more segregated. And maybe the theory was that with the addition of the Central Corridor line, that those eastern neighborhoods would gentrify and become whiter, and so the schools would, I don't know what their theory was. Mr. Martin, you say that, anyway, you seem to object to that, concentration of low-income housing in areas that are already pretty heavily concentrated. And Mr. Martin, you said that your job is to give people voice, their voice, but it seems to be that if you did, that there would be an outcry in the community that they would not want to be pushed out by these gentrifying folks that would kind of break up some of the concentrations of poverty. So, I mean, how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I don't agree that's what I said or what I meant in the statement.
Okay.
And I don't think the voices that we have here represent the entire community either.
No.
Yeah, so.
You said they did.
I've got a quick follow-up. I think your summary is pretty good. I mean, I think that's exactly right.
Oh, thank God.
I figured you'd appreciate that. The issue isn't we shouldn't put affordable housing in areas that are currently low income or highly racially segregated. I think the issue is we have to make affordable housing available in more places so that folks have the opportunity and choice to live wherever they like. But to be honest with you, my biggest point was we have a school system that is counting on, for whatever reason, assumptions about the integration of the housing in St. Paul. Now, you know, do they think Central Corridor is going to gentrify? I would actually say no. I don't think they've thought through what's going to happen in Central Corridor. I think that's the bigger problem. And meanwhile, you've got housing authorities doing things in St. Paul that are going to impact the schools that haven't taken into effect the policies that the school system is using. I think that's the big disconnect here. And I think the problem is we're going to have a situation where one side is expecting something different to happen, and we're going to end up with further segregation in both housing and schools.
Just in terms of the gentrification studies, I'd point you to the study that was commissioned by the Corridor Funders Collaborative Policy Link Study. That's the only one I'm aware of that discusses that, and it said there was not any evidence of gentrification in the Frogtown area.
I'm sorry?
It said there wasn't any evidence of gentrification ongoing there at that time. And perhaps toward the eastern side of the corridor, I'd be happy to give it to you, and I'm not aware of any studies that suggest that in these very, very poor neighborhoods where the schools are all poor, that there's...
Well, I didn't think so either, but I mean, maybe that was the foundation for their thinking. I have no idea. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll be getting copies of this tape if anyone would like a copy of it. We'll try to post it on our website, and be happy to provide anybody a copy of this evening. Thank you. We're done. We're adjourned.
Can't go, you know, because we're working on this. So, you know what I'm saying? They don't. We have over 20 million people.